Welcome, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us live and in person for the National Democratic Institute's second Information Integrity Conference, DISICON. For Zoom participants, you have translation in English, Albanian, and Serbian. I'm Nancy Soderberg, NDI's Senior Country Director for Kosovo. I am delighted to open this conference today, which will focus on discussing the challenges of information integrity and how to combat this threat. Our goal is to raise awareness of this threat to democracy and to build resiliency to counter it among Kosovo's citizens and the media. As Kosovo has one of the highest internet penetrations in Europe, it faces a very fragile media ecosystem and is vulnerable to information disorders. Kosovo's vibrant democracy is dependent on information integrity, a critical factor in the ability of citizens to hold their government accountable. Over the next 2 days, we have several remarkable local and international speakers with great insights and solutions to the challenge of information integrity on what both Kosovo and the world are doing. We will feature several dizzy stories from the people with firsthand experience with information integrity disorders. And while the pandemic restrictions mean that we have less people in person here today, we are still joined by people from the NGO community, journalists, political party communications officers, and others. And we welcome the ambassadors of the European Youth Democracy Network in Kosovo, as well as the students of journalism. We look forward to your active participation and the opportunity to network among us. And now I am delighted to welcome for opening remarks a champion of democracy throughout his work in the United States Senate, Department of Defense and State, and as the first U.S. ambassador to the Republic of the Union of Myanmar, the National Democratic Institute's president, Ambassador Derek Mitchell.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to provide some opening remarks at NDI Kosovo's second DISICON conference on information integrity, which, as Nancy says, is a critical subject for us all. Safeguarding the integrity of the information we are exposed to, defined as access to reliable, authentic, inclusive, and nonviolent information, is a global challenge these days. Over the next 2 days, this DISICON conference will discuss the growing threat to Kosovo's democracy and how best to combat it. But before I say more on that subject, I want to say a few thank yous at the top, as normal in these sessions. First, I want to thank Ambassador Philip Kosnad, whom we will hear from next, for his strong support for NDI in Kosovo, as well as for his excellent service to the United States, and USAID Mission Director Lisa Magno and her entire USAID team for their strong support for this and many other NDI programs in Kosovo. We literally could not do what we do without their partnership and support, and we cannot be more grateful. I want to thank all the many distinguished speakers and participants who will take part in this conference over the next 2 days. We are deeply honored for your time and presence. Thank you all for joining. And while I have the opportunity, let me extend a heartfelt shout out to the NDI team in Pristina. The team has worked in partnership over 2 decades with Kosovo's democratic leaders, institutions, and citizens. I traveled to Pristina almost exactly 2 years ago now and was tremendously impressed by their hard work, amazing energy and skill, and patriotic commitment to their country. Thank you, team, for all that you continue to do. And I am particularly pleased that Ambassador Nancy Soderberg has just arrived there in Pristina, finally, to lead the NDI team. Nancy has been working from Florida over the past year, but been itching to get out there on site and has finally been able to do so. I've known Nancy for longer than maybe either of us will acknowledge, but Kosovo cannot have a smarter, more experienced, dedicated, and enthusiastic advocate for the country and its democratic future than she. We are all fortunate she has agreed to take on this new assignment. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from local and international experts on information integrity about the growing threat to us all of disinformation and how we can combat it. Simply put, our democracies, all democracies, rely on access to accurate information, not only so our voters can make informed decisions, but also to hold our leaders accountable. The media industry is constantly changing, sometimes in unpredictable ways. How we get information in the digital era has likewise evolved in dramatic ways. While the internet has empowered billions with access to knowledge, it has also empowered those seeking to undermine democracy and create more avenues for vitriol and abuse against women, LGBTQI+ communities, and other marginalized groups. We use the term disinformation, but that's really shorthand for the broader problem of information manipulation. Disinformation is when false information is knowingly shared to cause harm. Misinformation is information that's incorrect, but there's no intent to deceive. Information integrity may also be violated when information is technically accurate, but is presented in a misleading context under false pretenses or is artificially amplified. That includes hate speech. It's important to take into account the whole package of information manipulation when looking at the problem. That means we all must be aware of the threat and develop ways to protect our societies and democracies against it as a matter of national security. Without reliable, authentic information, citizens cannot exercise their democratic rights and responsibilities freely and effectively. Manipulated information can lower public trust in a country's governing and oversight institutions and in its media, exploit social and political divisions, and weaken democratic institutions. Kosovo is by no means immune from this threat. NDI assessments have found Kosovo's information environment to be saturated with disinformation and other forms of manipulation and harmful speech. We have found strong anecdotal evidence of both international and domestic actors using disinformation to sway electoral outcomes, suppress investigative media coverage, and exploit ethnic and other social cleavages. Many conditions in Kosovo make the ground fertile for disinformation. The pandemic, the economic situation, deep political and ethnic divisions, the recent elections, and the dialogue with Serbia. Separate Albanian language and Serbian language news and information sources, in fact, also make Kosovo quite vulnerable to information manipulation, as partisan actors see an opportunity to exploit divisions and biases to mobilize voters, score quick political hits against opponents, and distract public focus. In this way, disinformation becomes normalized and commercialized for political gain. In 2017, NDI launched a global program to better understand this global threat, or this growing threat, and help our global partners develop ways to counter it. Recognizing the importance of a stronger information environment for Kosovo's emerging democracy in particular, NDI Kosovo, with the generous support of USAID, began a program in 2019 to comprehensively and systematically assess the integrity of information in Kosovo's traditional and online media so that we can better understand the impact of disinformation on your country. We will hear many of the findings from that assessment over the next 2 days here at DISICON. Our intention overall is to help local journalists and NGOs, including partners like the Association of Journalists in Kosovo, to better monitor and analyze the information environment and develop the skills themselves to build a strong foundation for information integrity in Kosovo. Our hope is that these partnerships evolve into a hub of coordinated activity among a variety of actors in Kosovo that will continue to analyze and ultimately combat future information disorders. I hope this conference galvanizes many of you to do the same, and that you take advantage of this opportunity to network best you can over this unique environment, and discuss the complex challenges to Kosovo's information space. I hope you share ideas, brainstorm on creative tools, and ask questions of your colleagues from different sectors, from politics, technology, academia, media, and civil society, because Kosovo must develop a concrete and comprehensive strategy to address the challenge of information integrity. To be successful, it must be a whole of society effort. NDI is proud to be able to organize this conference in partnership with USAID. We remain strongly committed to working with partners like you all out there in Kosovo and globally to address the threat to information integrity worldwide and make our democracies more resilient to stress. So I thank you all for joining, and I wish you all the best over the next 2 days at DISICON. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mitchell, for those insightful remarks and your strong support of our work here in Kosovo and around the globe. Next, we are delighted to be joined by U.S. Ambassador Philip Kosnet. All of us at NDI are so grateful for your support and that of the USAID mission, including Lisa Magno, Christine Danton, and Albana Kusara, and the entire team. Together, we have supported the people of Kosovo over 2 decades to build a resilient and dynamic democracy. Ambassador Kosnet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nancy.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for that kind invitation. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see Ambassador Derek Mitchell on the screen as well. So it's an honor and a privilege to be here today. When I last spoke at DISICON, it was December 2019, a long time ago. At that time, we didn't know that we were on the brink of a worldwide pandemic. How could we have known? Those scientists had been warning about it for years. And novels and movies had even been made about the possibility of a virus sweeping the world and citizens coming together despite their differences to defeat it. Okay, a lot of those novels and movies featured pandemics with zombies and vampires, but nonetheless, many of the themes were similar. And because we had heard these sorts of stories with dramatic elements, I think it became easier for some people to believe some of the disinformation involving the real pandemic. Things like criticism, skepticism without scientific basis of the vaccines. And this is how a lot of disinformation starts: false statements wrapped around nuggets of truth. Now, it can be a challenge separating fact from fiction, separating the possible from the impossible. What information is trustworthy? What disinformation is meant to deceive? Both types of information are found throughout the media landscape, on radio and on television, in the news shared in conversations with our friends and family, and especially on social media. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in the digital age, the sheer amount of information that is available and shared is tremendous. We can find information online to support our opinion or convince ourselves about almost anything. Conspiracies abound, rumors flow. In the midst of this flood of information, this glut of information, there are hardworking scientists, researchers, and journalists striving to provide citizens and their communities and around the world with accurate information. Information to guide citizens, businesses, and governments. Information so that families can plan for the future. And information so we can all enrich our minds and learn and grow. Those of you who attended the last conference heard me share my personal experiences about how news was exchanged back in the 1960s and 1970s, and anecdotes from history. Yes, I acknowledge it, I am a dinosaur, and a lot of my stories come from a long time ago. Now, I talked about how we received most of our news from nightly news broadcasts from only a few television stations. We couldn't go online at that time. There was no way to immediately fact check what we were hearing from news sources. If people wanted more information, we could search it out in books at the library or ask people we trusted for people who we trusted, who we saw as reliable sources. But it wasn't the same as being able to fact check through the many sources that are available now. And the last time we spoke, I also shared with you stories of authoritarian governments and how they use disinformation to control their citizens. Now, let me be clear. Disinformation is not only a tactic of authoritarian regimes. Disinformation is also found within democracies. The creation of disinformation in a democratic society is a lethal weapon, as we all saw on January 6th in Washington. Now, democratic elections are increasingly targeted by disinformation campaigns from both within and without, from the country where the election is taking place, as well as from abroad, whether it's to keep someone in power or prevent somebody else from coming to power, or to pave the way for a candidate who can do one's political bidding or perform favors in a certain way. Free and fair elections as a symbol of democracy may themselves be the target of disinformation campaigns. Now, while disinformation can come from any direction, governments have been one of the prime targets, not just here in Kosovo, but across the world. In America, we saw how the use of disinformation, the big lie, led to an attack on our capital on January 6th. In Kosovo, NDI has found that disinformation focused on the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated political tensions among parties, as well as promoting misogyny. In its media monitoring reports, NDI has continually reported that disinformation abounds in Kosovo elections. All political parties cast some sort of disinformation at their opponents in the last election. Female candidates were particularly attacked, often with harsh and sexist language. This was true in the last few elections, and it will continue. It will continue unless political party representatives make a conscious decision to refrain from using such language. I urge all political parties to do so. I urge all political parties to refrain from inflammatory, sexist language, misogynist language, disinformation, as it results in a divisive public discourse that benefits nobody. It certainly doesn't benefit the people of Kosovo. As we look towards Kosovo's upcoming local elections, let us all strive to prevent disinformation from spreading and infecting Kosovo's democracy. Now, let me speak to the journalists among us. Journalists have a particularly important role to play in combating disinformation. And I am pleased when I hear that so many young journalists and students of journalism are joining us virtually today. As journalists, your first responsibility is to speak the truth. And you have that responsibility more than anybody else because you hold the pen. In this social media age, that responsibility is even more serious as you as journalists can and do choose what to write, what to publish, what to share. I encourage you to uphold the highest standards of journalism in your work and continue to deliberately combat disinformation and misinformation. How do you do this? You do this by informing yourselves, holding yourselves to high ethical standards, and building in time when you're writing, even under deadline, for fact-checking and editorial practices. I know this is hard to do when you're under time pressure and your editors are screaming at you. But citizens are depending on you. They are depending on you as critical sources of reliable information. Because if the people can't trust journalists, who can they trust? More accurate media reporting from journalists and fact-check stories are important to combat disinformation, but they're not the only means. We can also come at this problem from different directions and across sectors, including civil society, academia, technology, and public institutions by collaborating and educating the public about the threat of disinformation, updating school curricula, and supporting programs that teach people critical thinking and media literacy. Now, I do hope that this conference and the media monitoring reports from NDI will help all of us to better recognize the information challenges around us in the digital age. I'd like to remind you that everybody, every citizen, every individual who reads, who shares, who amplifies information on social media, we all have a role to play in fighting disinformation. Okay. So my last point, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage journalists, relevant institutions, and civil society to begin developing the necessary tools for combating the phenomena discussed today, including by finding solutions to mitigate the use of information manipulation and harmful speech. We at the U.S. Embassy, we in the U.S. government are committed to working with our partners in Kosovo to help to build these tools and make these a reality for the citizens of this country. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Kosnet, for those wise remarks and your strong support again for our programming and the importance of Kosovo's democracy, and particularly the role of the media in preserving that. We are honored next to be joined by the distinguished Mr. Glenn Kessler, editor and chief writer of Washington Post Fact Checkers. Over 3 decades of journalism, he has covered foreign and domestic policy in public and private sectors, from the halls of the State Department to Wall Street. No one understands the art better of fact-checking in journalism or the challenges than Glenn. Thank you so much and welcome.
Glad to be with you. Do you want me to just make some opening remarks here?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So, I just want to compliment the ambassador on his opening statement. It was as if he was pitching for the idea of a fact-checking organization in Kosovo, and his points about the role of journalists and how journalists should not give in to time pressure to make mistakes or air incorrect facts are certainly well taken. I've been the editor and chief writer of the Washington Post Fact Checker since 2011, so almost 10 years. The Fact Checker started at the Washington Post in 2007 during the 2008 campaign. What we do is essentially we vet the accuracy of claims made by politicians and political organizations. We have a rating scale where we rate how accurate a statement is. It's kind of a reverse restaurant review. 4 stars is a good restaurant. For us, 4 Pinocchios is something that's a total whopper. We don't really use the word lie. We can't get into people's heads, but 4 Pinocchios is something that is really, really false. And it ranges down to 1 Pinocchio, which is something that is, mostly true, but has some factual problems with it. The Pinocchios have become kind of a part of the political lexicon here in the United States. Many politicians don't like to receive them. And so they have impact, our fact checks. At heart, the Washington Post Fact Checker is a policy column. We try to demystify complex policy issues. So we're not so much focused on false things that appear in social media. Now, in the 10 years that I have been doing the Fact Checker, obviously social media has become a big part of our lives. We distribute the Fact Checker over Twitter, over Facebook. We debunk things that politicians might say on those platforms, particularly former President Trump. We were constantly correcting his tweets. But we're less focused on things that are not distributed by politicians. The one area that we've definitely focused a lot on in recent years is manipulated video. This is something that happens often, increasingly in politics in the United States, where politicians will clip things out of context to create controversy, or they will even manipulate it, or you have deep fakes. So that is something that within the political context where we have placed a lot of scrutiny on, and we developed at the Washington Post a metric for how to grade different categories of manipulated video. Now, the one big issue you face in fact checking is that social science research shows that people are receptive to information that confirms their preconceived notions. And this is especially true with politics. I'll cite one study. A study quizzed participants on data that measured the effectiveness of a skin cream product, and people with good math skills could interpret the data correctly. But when the same survey participants were shown similar numbers on whether gun control increased or decreased crimes, liberals and conservatives who were good at math misinterpreted the results to conform to their political leanings. In other words, once politics was introduced, people could not accept a finding that conflicted with their beliefs, even if it meant forgetting how to correctly read data on a chart. On top of that, a 2017 study found that 2/3 of liberals and conservatives surveyed were simply uninterested in hearing the views of the other side of a contentious issue, such as guns or climate change, even when they were offered extra money to do so. Another study from 2018 found that people who were exposed to tweets from political opponents for a month actually made them less tolerant. Liberals became somewhat more liberal and conservatives became substantially more conservative. So this is a real problem you face as a fact checker. It's hard to understand whether or not the information you're providing is getting through to people. And I experience this on a daily basis. Swarms of Bernie Sanders fans have attacked me ruthlessly from the left whenever I fact-checked a senator from Vermont. Then, if I poorly rate a statement by a Republican, the other side of the Twitterverse will gang up on me. Increasingly, the criticism from both camps has become highly personal, with Twitter trolls digging into my family history in an effort to discredit my findings. So when you're confronting falsehoods like this, you generally have to have a pretty thick skin. And fortunately, I work at a place like the Washington Post, which gives me a lot of institutional support. Now, the other thing that has happened in the last decade is that interest in political fact-checking has exploded around the globe. In 2011, when I took over the Fact Checker, there were just a handful of fact-checking organizations in the world, 3 of which were in the United States. Now, there are more than 300 fact-checking organizations in just about every country in Europe and Latin America, and it is spreading across Africa and Asia as well. The number of fact-checkers has doubled since 2016, according to a count by Duke University, with fact-checking organizations now found in 84 countries, including in many countries in the Balkans. I've helped craft an international set of principles to guide the movement going forward, which includes committing to fact-checking all political parties fairly and without favor. Members of the International Fact-Checking Network, which agree to these principles, are assessed every year by outside experts to make sure the fact-checking organization is living up to these principles. And the impact this growing movement has can be felt during the recent pandemic, or the current pandemic, actually. During the pandemic, IFCN members joined together to create what we call the Coronavirus Facts Database. There were contributions from more than 90 fact-checkers in 70 countries in 40 different languages. The database at this moment contains more than 12,000 fact checks, and it has allowed researchers to trace the spread of major COVID-19 claims around the globe. So despite the torrent of misinformation we see in the world, I think the growth of fact-checking in so many countries is certainly a testament to the fact that journalists are coming together and NGOs to combat it on a global scale. And I'm happy to take your questions now, Nancy.
For that amazing insight and for your work in really trying to help keep democracies strong and vibrant so that the population and the media can be informed on what is really happening and really hold their governments accountable. Let me just take a couple of minutes that we have remaining to ask you a couple of questions. And the first would be on the disinformation as a threat to democracy. We've seen a lot going around in the United States as well, but it's very much in this region in Eastern Europe as well. And could you assess and sort of inform the audience what the impact of disinformation, misinformation is in maintaining a healthy democracy and really holding governments accountable? And thank you again. That was just fascinating insights.
You're welcome. Well, yeah, disinformation is increasingly a concern. I mean, and the United States has a pretty vibrant democracy, but it is definitely under threat. At the Washington Post, we cataloged every false or misleading statement made by President Trump. It totaled more than 30,000. And it was quite a task to assemble that database, which is easily searchable and available to anyone, particularly researchers if they want to study it. But at one point, we did a poll because we were curious. One of the things that President Trump did was he would constantly repeat false claims. And we wanted to see if actually that false information was penetrating into people's minds. Did they begin to believe it? And we did this about 2 years into his term. And we found actually that and we asked, is this fact correct? Yes, this fact or the opposite, and then people could choose. We did not identify that it came from Trump. And what we found was that even Trump supporters did not believe his false claims. and generally most Americans understood that what he had been saying about his record or his opponents was not true. Now, that was 2 years into his administration. And one thing that we haven't done a poll since then, but I fear that the falsehood, the lie that he has been telling about the 2020 election, which has been amplified across conservative websites, conservative networks, and also embraced increasingly by members of his party, that has actually taken root. And that's a very pernicious thing to take root, to basically say the last election that happened in the United States was based on a lie and a falsehood and was not counted correctly. Because that gets at the heart of democracy, and it makes the stakes higher for the next presidential election. So that's, I had kind of started the feeling that the impact of Trump by the end of his term would be less than I had anticipated, but the continued embrace of this lie about what happened in the 2020 election is certainly a cause for worry.
Well, thank you. I think we have about a minute left, so I will just take one more question. And this is kind of, how can journalists really combat this? What our polls here are shown that while people are aware of disinformation, 20 to 30% actually still believe it, even though that they sort of are susceptible about it. It does get into their consciousness. I love your Pinocchios. I've watched them for years. Maybe we can adopt that here. But maybe just for the audience here, with this proliferation of disinformation, how do you see the role of journalists being transformed, and what is their responsibility in trying to keep the information integrity alive here?
Well, the key thing is to do your job. Be accurate. Do not believe everything that, if someone's, there's a saying here in the United States journalism, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. You just have to always check the facts. And even though it may be in a government document or it may come out of a politician's mouth, it may not be correct. You've got to run it down and verify. And the more you verify and the more you get a reputation for being accurate and correct, the more credibility you will have. So the key thing is, like I said, is do your job. We used to say here at the Washington Post, we were not at war with the Trump administration. We were just at work. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I can give you is, stay true to the facts and the truth, and good things should follow from that.
Well, thank you so much. And for those insights, we're not at war, we're at work is a very good motto. And it can sometimes feel like the journalists are at war. For being in the trenches for all these years for us, and for joining us. And we look forward to having you back, and hopefully in person in Kosovo at some point. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Now let me hand the program over to our very own NDI program officer, Adea, and she will continue facilitating the discussion. Please stay with us, our audience. We have great discussions coming up. Our great presentations are about to happen, and I'll hand it over to Adea. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nancy. Dëgjuam bashkërisht një diskutim mjaft interesant.
We had a very interesting conversation with Greg Kastner from Washington Post, who highlighted the fact and the need for verifying the facts. In fact, what is the practice in Kosovo? If that is disinformation or misinformation in Kosovo, and yes, to what extent? And what are the challenges and main problems in the media environment in Kosovo? The answer to these questions and the discussion on these matters will be provided by the first panel in DISICON conference with regards to information integrity in media environment in Kosovo. The panelists are Victor Brader, expert for security and disinformation in Ministry of Defense in Slovakia, who will join us through Zoom, and through Zoom, we will also have the scholar of Agder University, Abid Hoja, and present in this hall is the university lecturer. Brennan and Berisha served as external consultants for the assessment of information integrity in Kosovo. The NDI in Kosovo developed conducted a research on online media and social media and measured the opinion poll regarding these matters. In this panel, we will have the Deputy Director of NDI, Mr. Valon Khorasani, who is invited to the stage.
Idea. Up on the job. Okay.
Can you guys hear me? I think we're good. Thank you. Thank you for your presence. Most of us get information today online. An NDI found that the environment, the information environment has distortion, had untrue, inaccurate information. It had exaggeration of information as well as deliberately harmful information from 265 sources that had a distortion of information and untrue information. We have analyzed, or we have ended up with 262 shares, disseminations, whether online or through social media, and at the end, they had a reach of 3.2 million, or users, namely, because there could be one user with many equipment, so it's not necessarily 3.2 million people, but user accounts. The sample that we have used was using those that are more relevant. So when there was something more relevant, or where there was a doubt of non-true information, we took 3,693 news articles of them, 1,289 Facebook posts, 500 tweets, and also 1,000 Serbian articles, of which 214 news articles and posts. One of five are articles in portals. We have 59 Facebook posts and 50 Twitter posts. With the Albanian speaking sample, we saw that the dissemination of the inaccurate information occurred both horizontally and vertically. Horizontally from one portal to another, quick distribution, and we observed that the dissemination of an article from one portal to another occurred on average within 43 minutes. So basically, it took an article 43 minutes to end up from one portal to another. And we're talking about articles which included in them inaccurate or untrue information. And each of this article was shared by at least 7 other portals, was reshared. So the amplification was significant. And through 995 shares of 105 articles, it reached over 700,000 users, potential users. And then we've had 59 posts on Facebook with a 2,900 shares, reaching 1.3 million users. In Twitter, we have much less, since the usage of Twitter is minimal in Kosovo. We found 50 tweets that had an untrue information, and which in total had a reach of about 17,000 users. With the Serbian-speaking sample, what we saw is that we've had a limitation, if you will, of the information that is generated in Serbian. And mainly this information comes from the media which are based in Belgrade, or in Serbia, that is. The recent sampling found that of 1,000 articles, 50 of them had an untrue or an inaccurate information, a distortion of information, of which we had 566 shares and 1,831 tweets. We had a reach of 1.1 million users. An additional element with a Serbian-speaking sample is that the majority of the origin was not in social media, but rather the origin was in portals. Some of the data of the information using the sample. For example, the countries that we've taken, the portals that end up with the untrue information. For example, from Albania, we have 11 portals, media portals. From the Albanian diaspora, 5, Bosnia 1, in Kosovo 55, Northern Macedonia 4, in Serbia 38. And 13 others that are automated monitoring, caught or captured. In Albanian, we've monitored 146 Facebook pages, 49 in Serbian speaking, 10 Facebook groups in Albanian, 31 accounts in Albanian in Twitter, and 73 online portals, and 43 in Serbian speaking, basically. So 375 as a total number of origins where the news was generated. So we saw fluctuations in interaction in social media with inaccurate information. So basically, this is the frequency, how often the posts were shared, posts that had inaccurate information. Did these narratives have an impact? Well, we have some examples here, some political examples. For example, in this diagram here, we see some of the narratives that have been shared in Facebook the most. So we have 750, the highest, and 300, the lowest shares on Facebook. So this is the potential implication of this inaccurate statement, whether from political parties or from political leaderships. And the next chart shows the number of the reach of some of the narratives. So the highest is 280,000 users reached, and the lowest is about 58,000. So we see that the distribution and the reach of posts is very high, and it affects a large number of people in general. Looking at the clicks on portals, depending on which inaccurate narrative was used, we have, for example, the first one with 117,000 clicks, or the lowest 42,000 clicks. In Serbian-speaking portals, regardless that these are not only applicable for Kosovo, but since they mainly come or originate from Serbia, there are higher numbers there. For example, we have narratives which were clicked by 300,000 users, mainly involving inaccurate information regarding the national elections in February, and the lowest with 119,000 clicks. To see what the real impact is on the citizens and to have an analysis of trends and which sources do citizens believe in, what are the perceptions in general with regard to the integrity of information in Kosovo, we have made a series of questions, and for which we will present some charts. For example, what's the most reliable source of information to you? Not the viewership, but the reliability. And it turns out that 56% have said that the TV is more reliable than online portals, local media, or information that they can get from friends or family members. If we break down this sample into Albanian speaking and Serbian speaking, we see the breakdown of the information landscape in Kosovo between Albanian speaking and Serbian speaking. In Kosovo, Albanian speakers believe Kosovo televisions, and Serbs believe Serbia-based television stations. We've asked them whether you believe that online news portals ever report inaccurate information. Yes, regularly was 32%. Yes, occasionally 42%. No, they don't 6%. I don't know, or refuse 29%. So we see that a large number of people believe that portals indeed launch inaccurate and untrue information in Kosovo. Why do they do that? Financial gain, 38%. To push a certain agenda, 17%. Accidentally, because they don't check the facts, 15%. Altogether, 11%. I don't know, 12%. Do you think that the untrue information is distributed in the social media today in Kosovo? Yes, regularly, 29%. Yes, occasionally. 42%. No, 6%. I don't know. 20. Refuse. 3%. So a large part believe that the social media disseminate inaccurate information. If you would see such an information, what would your approach be? How would you verify it? With family and friends, 48%. I would look other media sources, 42%, social media, 12%, and verification of information, 14%. So we saw that there is an awareness that there could be a misinformation or untrue information in the media landscape. But when it comes to media literacy, we see that citizens don't know how to potentially verify the information, while majority rely on family and friends.
From an ethnic perspective, Albanians 48% focus on families and friends, and Serbs at a higher extent, 35% is verification of the source of information, which potentially tells us that a higher level of consciousness is with them regarding the checking of source of information. More advanced age relates to family and friends. We tested some of inaccurate false information as narratives for COVID-19. We all know that there was disinformation, continuous misinformation. We wanted to see to what extent are Kosovo citizens immune to know if an information is accurate or not. We see that every fifth, every fourth, or every third citizen believes in one of the narratives, which in fact are all false and inaccurate. That is a strong basis that the citizens will accept disinformation and misinformation as something for granted. We also tested political declarations or statements which were false and inaccurate and were distributed by the political parties and political leadership. And we saw that their impact on citizen is high. Every fifth, every fourth, every third of them believed an inaccurate or false narrative. And this creates a strong foundation and strong appetite for distributing disinformation, but also creates a foundation for external interference. If the ethnical divisions are misused and political divisions are misused, the possibility for external involvement is increased. We have a slide here, and somebody might ask why we put it under the disinformation. So we have to explain two things, in fact. Here, we are dealing with the analysis of partiality in terms of preference and prejudgment that a certain individual has for an institution or state. We have explicit partiality, whereby we are aware of, for example, of our political preferences, but also implicit impartialities, which are stereotypes which we are not aware of. We express them without being aware of. Why this is important for communication and information? Knowing this impartiality or partiality, we are able to identify to what extent a citizen accepts a source of information. The penetration of information from the disinformation source can challenge you or can make you accept it more easily. This stands out if we see from the perspective of ethnicities. And here we can reach a conclusion as to how disinformation, inaccurate information, and coordinated campaigns can penetrate and can misuse partialities and preferences that we as citizens have toward these institutions or countries. To further discuss this matter today, we have three experts who participated in our assessments, and we will jointly continue our discussion. As they were presented at the beginning by Adia, today in the panel, we will discuss together with Arta, who is an experienced journalist in Kosovo but also lecturer, and then with Abid, a lecturer from the Norway University, and Victor, who is a disinformation expert and security expert in the Ministry of Defense of Slovakia, and I hope he will join us soon. Abid, perhaps we could start with you. The recent developments put the journalism in the line of fire in a way as a result of transfer of communication, quality, impact, but also credibility of journalism. At the same time, we see orchestrated campaigns for distributing disinformation, misinformation, and very often they happened inadvertently. If you could tell us briefly or in a summarized way, what are these preconditions that enable the disinformation in the context of Kosovo? Thank you very much, Valon. I hope that you can hear me. If you could just confirm, yes? Okay. Perhaps it would be good to start more or less where the previous speakers So let's focus on Kosovo from bottom up of media landscape in Kosovo, and I will start from a positive aspect. Kosovo, nevertheless, despite all the problems, all the challenges we face in Kosovo, Kosovo is ranked well in the rankings of a Freedom House report. Kosovo, even though in the last year it has a slight decline, it stands well in comparison with other countries in the region, and this is the merit of all journalists and all media workers and other relevant institutions in Kosovo. So we should give credit for a good job done. And we have to continue regulating the media landscape in many aspects. To answer more accurately to your question, we have to look at the media landscape from a broader perspective. We have to look at the journalists, the role, their function, the perception of their role, the audience in Kosovo. To what extent is the audience in Kosovo is ready to consume the news? And what is the media life in Kosovo? The institutional trust, the media trust on relevant institution, but also the function of media in our democracy. So to start this overview of the media landscape as a preconditions, we have to look at a typical journalist. A typical journalist in Kosovo, according to the 2 to 3 year old statistics of academic study, worth of journalism study, Kosovo, the journalist is around 26 years old. He has 6 to 8 years of experience, and in Kosovo, this is much lower than in region and much lower than in European Union. Journalists have diplomas, they have formal education, but they don't have much experience. They are not in Newsweek. They cover various area, and this hinders their profilization or specialization in investigating journalism, more thorough journalism. So in this regard, as a media landscape, it has problems with raising awareness about the news, especially the media. these these news are provided without filters, namely who, what, why, where. So, and without editing and verification. This is a huge problem because credibility on news will decline, and as a result, the critical thinking, then converging of editorials and the time reduction for the production of news is very problematic because the time for producing the news has been decreased. Then exposure to disinformation, intentional disinformation, is an external problem. It's also internal problem, but the main problem in this regard is inability to verify information. In a word, a culture of journalism has been created which provides journalism that copies the someone else's statements and considers it as a source of information without verifying such information from another alternative source or from another more independent source of information. Lack of media transparency is another problem. Revenues, finance of media is not transparent. This is another big problem. On the other hand, media products are consumed by an audience in Kosovo, which in the best case scenario has less than average education. I say less than average education, considering the international reports of on level of education in Kosovo. In Kosovo, the trust in news is quite high in TVs, but also as you presented, and the trust remains in the traditional media, but information is also obtained from social media and online media. And this is kind of abnormality in the news consumption. Trust should be is illustrated also in the context of this trust being manifested on another aspects. Another aspect of disinformation is that the purpose of disinformation is not to make the audience believe in something unbelievable. For example, in cases of vaccination, a certain chip is installed is is such an unbelievable news, but the purpose of this news is not to lie to the people, but to further reduce the trust in information related to vaccination. So audience targeting through disinformation campaign is reducing the trust of citizens in true news. Same happens with news which are broadcast for the purpose of reducing the trust of Kosovo audience, including Albanians and Serbs, in the European project or in democracy, or in order to portray Russian foreign policy as a counterbalance policy for human rights, which is another problem. Same news for Kosovo security forces and NATO and so on. Another special news for me is media trust based on the ethnicity. Albanians believing in the Albanian media, Serbs believing in Serbian media. This way, media landscape in Kosovo is divided and there's no mutual trust. When you said earlier, when you provided these statistics, you said that over 30% of people believe that portals regularly distribute false information, and such percentage also believed in false statements. So they are exposed and they believe such fake news. All this tells us, in a way, that the audience in Kosovo does not understand the news well, does not have media education, proper media education, and the journalists, as a special role in society, they do not receive a feedback from the audience in order to improve their job. I have to highlight that the functioning of media and democracy related to media is that the social changes are irreversible. In Kosovo, the social changes are irreversible, which means that Kosovo society has 2 million SIM cards with access to internet, and this is irreversible fact in the transmission of information. So the entire system, media, broadcast of any kind, should think of this as a scope of action which is there not temporarily but permanently. And this challenges democracy as we know now. Democracy is something evolving in a way, and in my opinion this is how the regulation of media is also challenged in Kosovo. Both institutions that govern media in Kosovo, they do a good job, but they have to think in this context how to address these matters, how to address information which come to the web pages, for example, that come from British Virgin Islands or Caribs, and they are streamed through European countries. So Kosovo does not have a strategy from the cybernetic aspect of internet protocols to cooperate with distributors of social media in this regard. So it should be mentioned that the next challenge of Kosovo society is precisely this: challenged democracy, or democracy in decline, whereby one of the pillars of the decline in democracy, both in the European Union but also members of European Council, is the issue of journalism, free media, and democracy in relation to media. So this is how I would summarize the answer to your question, and I am also open for upcoming questions. Thank you very much, Abid. Perhaps we could continue with Arta so that we could relate to the positions highlighted by Abid. Arta, where does the responsibility of journalists and media end, and where does the responsibility of citizens start in order to be more aware and more intelligent in obtaining the information? Thank you very much, Valion. So a public thanks to NDI for their dedication to this topic. It is a very complex topic with problems that derive from several factors. It is nothing, it's not everything with social media, journalists, public, political parties, but all of them interfere with one another. So I truly appreciate the role and contribution of NDA in this field, because in order to deal with this field, you have to know the importance of journalism in democracy, and you have to love it as a work, as a engagement. You have to know the responsibility of journalism as a system, which differs from other means of communication, which is absolutely necessary for a democratic society as Kosovo is, or other countries are. So to relate to how I see all these issues or these problems, in US in 1997, an event took place from which a book derived, and the book is The Elements of Journalism, a basic book which is recommended to schools as a textbook or certain chapters of it. This is a book which is quoted in many studies, scientific studies of social fields that we use. So what happens in 1997 is something which later is named the concerned community of the concerned journalists. and the issues are mainly come from some measurements of public opinion poll, whereby the media is in decline, which is more or less to the event that we have here now in Kosovo some 20 years later. So the members of the Committee of Concerned People are journalists, regular people, writers, and so on, and they ask themselves two questions. If the one dealing with information is convinced that journalism is different from other means of communication, what is that difference? And another question, if the journalism should change by preserving some basic principles, what are those principles? Now these principles, even though they have their rises and declines due to the developments in the communication science, they withstood the time. And to this day, we saw the media, professional media, the journalism, respect these principles, which are very well written in the Code of Ethics of Press Conference of Kosovo, but also Code of Ethics of the Independent Media Commission. So what are these principles? They are very simple. Loyalty to people. So journalists do not see citizens as clients. Unfortunately, today in online media, the citizen is seen as a client, as a person who has to click on a certain title, which most of the cases, as we saw in this results of the opinion poll, is disinformation or misinformation. And today we have a large percentage of opinion of public which do not believe in portals or online media. Then we have to address these questions. What is the problem? A country that does not have newspapers is a country which, in terms of journalism, has problems, and we have to accept it in order to address it as a solution. If we do not have newspapers, not a single newspaper is printed. What did we replace newspapers with? Which means of communication did we replace newspapers? Did we replace newspapers with marketing, with propaganda? Did we replace newspapers with information produced by political parties and which are further recycled and distributed through portals? This is a question which I believe, because we've seen from the newspapers that we saw, only one newspaper stands well in its online version, and it makes continuous effort to respect, comply with the principles of journalism, namely loyalness to citizens, truth, verification of information, which is a key process before the publication of any news. Even the simplest, briefest news has to go through a verification process. What happens today in online media in Kosovo, but also in the region, is that in verification we face lots of problems, but also in accountability. We are not held accountable for unverified or false information that we posted yesterday, for example. So we realize how a false news circulates within an hour in seven different portals, and I think this is very concerning. So, with the exception of us that are here to discuss it as phenomenon, all other stakeholders who also understand journalism as a system should get together in order to inform the citizen and give the citizens the possibility of self-governance. What does this mean? Now we are on the eve of the local elections. The well-informed citizens will be more able to elect the right persons in the municipal assemblies, but also the mayors of municipalities. And if they choose the proper people, we will have better governance. And people who are less informed, they will have more difficulties to choose proper persons as mayors, but also as MPs at local level, because sometimes we disregard their importance as local MPs. Another issue that was mentioned and which is very important, and it's not a problem in Kosovo only, namely the role of some digital forms such as Facebook. I see it as a dramatic development as to how media function, namely how Facebook and political parties function. It is very important for political parties to refrain themselves from posting false news on Facebook, either through their groups, which are considered closed, which in fact are open, because tens of thousands of people have access to it, and they are exposed to such fake news. Secondly, media, the relation of media with Facebook should be seen from the longer perspective, because if the journalists media gives such power to Facebook and all their work is done for Facebook as to how many clicks they obtain, we will lose our role as intermediaries between media and citizens and the government. So once we lack communication or communication is reduced between governmental stakeholders and media, this is very concerning, because the government, the presidency will choose a one-way communication because they understood that millions of clicks or likes that they get on Facebook is better than contacting us as journalists to become their mediators or intermediaries. So this requires a more critical and analytical approach, because it has to be seen in a longer term as to our relation with Facebook. That's why I see everything that is happening currently as dramatic. In our research, there was a tendency to analyze the role of state, and we have to understand that the state is the primary definer of the information, because the government provides us with information about daily politics, and our information depends on what we obtain from the state. On the other hand, it is also the basis that government and parliament provide for a media which is pluralist but also independent. Whenever we say state intervention in media, this is a very sensitive issue, but we have to understand that the state is the one that made all these laws that we have, and on which journalists function freely. There is a law on sources of information, law against infamy and slander, law on whistleblowers, whereby people inside the institutions can denounce an irregularity. So the only sector or area where the state can intervene and appoint the director of the broadcast is the public broadcast. So in order to create a better functioning environment of better functioning of media in Kosovo. Thank you very much. So you touched on the essence, namely refraining disinformation by political parties, but you also stressed the normative aspect of the self-regulation of media, which is another also important. And finally, the raising of people's awareness about the information. Now we will pass the floor to Victor.
Here as well in Kosovo. You have been a war correspondent and published story from different places, including Libya, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, also Ukraine, that have seen a hybrid war and quite have been in the front line for disinformation. And you have seen this information operations, you have seen this irregular warfare going on. So who are the producers of misinformation and disinformation, according to you? And where it's coming from?
Thank you, Velen, and let me just thank everyone for the kind invitation. I think the work you're doing with NDI in Kosovo is really important, as this is a very contemporary issue, and it's a very important one, and it's not going to go away. On the contrary, this is becoming increasingly a serious, more serious danger to democracy and security of every country. Thank you for the introduction and for the connection to warfare. I have been a war correspondent for some years before I switched to academia and then to public service here at the Ministry of Defense. Disinformation is strictly connected with political violence because political violence is socially constructed. It is discursively constructed. You must talk about violence before any violence can actually happen. We've seen that on the beginnings of all conflicts as well, in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, anywhere you have talks about, you have the othering of the opponent. Just having structural preconditions for war isn't simply enough. You must have discursive conditions. You must have influences of political figures who by creating disinformation and propaganda, and they furthering their own goals, or they may end up actually in real political violence. So yes, I've not only seen what disinformation can do or how disinformation works, but I've seen the actual violence. I think I have prepared some notes for today, because what I think is neglected in the debates about disinformation today, we've talked about media regulation, we talk about the actors who are the malicious actors or the proxies, state or non-state, who proliferate disinformation. We talk about the kinds of disinformation, misinformation. We struggle with definitions. We even can't really define what a media is. That's a current problem of the European Commission, for example, is trying to regulate social media. What we are neglecting in this whole equation when we are trying to understand how to battle disinformation, which is very serious indeed, is the position of the recipient. When we're talking about political propaganda, which it really is, well, they have some is for financial gain, but most of it is political propaganda. We are somehow neglecting the role of the propagandee itself. And I think the angle that we should be aware of is somehow socio-psychological. And that angle, in my experience with government across European Union, across NATO, is, I mean, honestly ignored and not considered at all, but I think it's a very important angle. So I'll just talk about it briefly. And we must understand that we are living in mass societies, and in order to hold mass societies together, we need media. So we are not living in a village where we know all the 200 inhabitants, so we can interact all together with each other. What we need is a common ideology, a healthy sense of nationalism, if you want. But that needs to be replicated through some media channels that hold a great community together. I can't just know everyone in Los Angeles if I'm living in New York. I mean, the concept is fairly simple. So what happens is that with the disintegration of traditional microgroups of the past, such as family, village, church, and brotherhood bonds, the individual is plunged into mass society and thrown back upon his own inadequate resources, his isolation, loneliness, and ineffectuality. He must bear increasing working hours and taxation and noise and crowded cities and tempo of work, poor sanitation, housing shortage, never changing daily routine, lack of personal accomplishment, family insecurity, and all the package you get in big cities, talking about not necessarily Western world, anywhere is the case. And if you are not living in a society of which the educational system provides for equipping individuals with tools that they can use to cope with that situation, that is fairly new for the human race, really, last, 150 years perhaps, since the Industrial Revolution, you simply will get a whole society of people who are extremely susceptible to mass propaganda that has been enhanced with the revolution in information affairs, especially talking about social networks, which is entirely different discussion. The individual isn't equipped to bear these disturbing and paralyzing, traumatic influences. Moreover, men cannot stand being unimportant. They deserve to assert themselves, to express authority, to be somebody, to be perceived as such. They realize that they depend on decisions over which they have no control, and that realization drives people to despair. The individual feels the need to be reintegrated into a community, experience ideological and effective communications. Well, propaganda, if it's done well, provides for what people have lost and crave. A raison d'etre, a personal involvement, participation in important events, the need for self-affirmation, justification of their doubtful impulses, the need to believe and to obey, to create and hear fables, to communicate in the language of myth and symbols. Propaganda aims to explain correctly the present state of affairs, which is a universal truth in the business we are in. To the marginalized individual who's burdened with work and personal trouble, it offers him a simple and clear, false, satisfying explanation of the world in which he lives. Propaganda can work with this information, whatever we want to call it, in two directions, and they can do work together simultaneously. It can discourage from participation in public affairs, strengthening distrust of state institutions by weakening the inner cohesion of the group or a whole society, or entirely disintegrate. Yet it can do exactly the opposite and sometimes at the same time. It integrates the individual into a collective movement that serves as a substitute for that organic community which the individual has lost with the rise of mass society. Like, just picture the anti-vaccination movement, picture QAnon, picture the proxy groups of bikers who are sort of imitating the night wolves, the Russian sort of military, civilian instruments of hybrid warfare who are on sanction lists in the US and Canada, by the way. It is essential for any modern organization or nation state, but also inevitable for an entity as massive as a nation state, because certain ideas and values must be shared and continuously reproduced in order to keep the cohesion of a given group intact. Large groups can only function when their members participate, give their support and consent, real or imagined, which in turn provides them with the impression that they are acting in conformity with collective beliefs, which provide security and guarantee that one acts properly. Being integrated into collective movements, for example, as a patriotic supporter of one state and its policies, the individual is able to express his common sense, his desires, wrath and indignation, feelings of justice and desire for freedom. Propaganda can lift people up from their daily troubles by creating the feeling that they are free, enlightened, they understand the intricacies of this world, and that they are involved in dangerous and exciting activities. It eliminates the inner conflict, the tension, the self-criticism, self-doubt. It offers stability, security, and certain satisfaction, while all of it is acquired without effort, experience, work, reflection, or criticism. It hands the individual a key with which he can open all doors. Where there is no more mystery, everything can be explained. It gives him a special glasses through which he can look at the present day history and clearly understand what they mean. Well, every person has an intimate, universal need for explanations that would provide answers to given situations and ease emotional tensions. Propaganda responds to the same need, yet in more sophisticated ways. It will permit and promote dangerous and destructive tendencies that were so far prohibited, such as hatred and justification of otherwise unacceptable violence. Just making a loop back towards Mr. Ambassador was speaking before, the incident at the Congress, which is exactly that. I believe one of the attorneys of the gentleman with horns, who's now accused of a specific crime, I'm not entirely sure what the name of that is arguing that he is a victim of such propaganda and therefore not liable for his crimes. I think that angle is fairly neglected in all discussions about how we can counter disinformation. And this should be considered. We must not only debunk and explain why certain narratives or campaigns are not truthful, because debunking is an important tool, but it's yet just one hammer in a very huge toolbox. And it's a very small part of our reaction to disinformation, an important one, a vital one, but it's very far from being a universal one. And make no mistake, disinformation is not going to go away. We're moving away from kinetic warfare to non-kinetic warfare, simply because, I mean, there's so many reasons. Two that really stand out for me is the proliferation of, proliferation, really equalization of conventional weapons. Everyone can have conventional weapons fairly of the same power. Therefore, any real kinetic conflict is very costly, expensive, long, and these days fairly, really difficult to justify to anyone, to any audiences. And the other thing is a proliferation of so many kinds of international treaties of all sorts, whether be it economic or political, that tie nation states together on many different levels with many very important interests. So if we're talking about attaining political power, which war really is, it's according to the Clausewitzian tradition, is simply getting the opponent to do what you want, imposing his will, your will on the opponent, just doing it by military means. What we are seeing today, disinformation and propaganda, the political one, is pushing your will onto the opponent without ever firing a shot. And the will of nation states trying to do that, it's not going away. It's staying, it's remaining the same. It's been the same forever since the dawn of humanity, and it's going to continue until, well, who knows until when, but certainly it's not going away in the next 10 years. So it is very vital that we find answers to disinformation. One other important aspect of the recent developments since, let's say,
Victor,
7, 8 years.
if you can keep it within a minute, would be appreciated.
Okay.
Final remark.
Say again, please.
If you can keep it within final words within a minute, would be appreciated.
All right. One more thing is that polarization of the political spectrum. Just look at how 10 years ago we've been looking, at least in Europe, at a very vast political spectrum where you have the centralists, then you have leftists, then you have right-wingers, then you have something in between. What you see today, that even the proliferation of disinformation or of mobilization techniques of politicians who use disinformation as everyday tool has moved into national parliaments, even the European Parliament. So what you got is the polarization of the whole spectrum that was more colored, let's say, just 10 years ago, and you got one side, and it's really not important whether it's left or right, politicians who offer actual policies, forward-looking policies who are moving the country forward. Then you have national populists who mobilize by creating an imaginary danger, who use this information as primary mobilization technique. So if I should remain with one final sort of recommendation for everyone, elect politicians who actually work with policies, not with fear-mongering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for your insights. I kemi diku edhe 7-8 minuta.
We have 7 or 8 more minutes. I don't know if we received any online question from audience. We can take 2 questions. Greetings, Mentor Hoxha from CSP of Kosovo. I think it's very important. First of all, media cannot be put into one bag. We have to divide TV media from printed media and from portals. Secondly, also verification of news and fake news should also be divided from serious and registered media to those unregistered and non-serious, namely registered media and Kosovo Journalism Association, whereby non-serious one produce like 100 pieces of news and their origin is mainly in Macedonia and other countries. This indicates, even though we should have analysis to identify what is the source of the fake news, precisely due to the nature mentioned by you and the previous speakers that we are dealing with a digital reading who is mainly in social media. In social media, the reader not necessarily assesses or makes this distinction between serious and non-serious media. This could help to a large extent to have the reader reach important conclusion is how to fight disinformation, fake news, even though this claimate is very important because digital reader suffices to read the title and the photos to make the disinformation even more proliferating. I made this comment on the first day because the orientation should be such in order to reach the conclusions that would have a significant impact on the reader and on the media. We can see on daily basis that serious media make mistakes, have shortcomings, especially during the elections when we perform monitoring of fake news and we denounce them. We observed that serious media distributed unconfirmed videos. Some of the videos were made public, whereby they were fake news, which were initially distributed and then withdrawn. So the reader consumes what is on Facebook, for example. On Facebook, we have both serious and non-serious media, which mainly have sources from outside Kosovo, and we made public the fake news that target audience outside Kosovo, mainly diaspora. we as community find it very important, and we continue to stress that the first orientation in fighting disinformation is in the source, what it was produced, in order to then to prevent such a proliferation of disinformation. So this was only comment, right? Okay. So we have a question from online. Greetings. Greetings. Mike, I wanted to raise an issue as to why there is so much disruption in Kosovo, specifically between media, political stage, and citizens. Why there is no sense of cooperation and ecosystem whereby all three elements could interact in order to increase the collective knowledge, why the standards are so low in terms of media, and why there is no professional ethics to work on this issue. Thank you very much. Are you addressing this question to anyone specifically? No, it's general question, whoever wants to answer. Thank you. Arta or Abid, would you like to contribute? I would be more concerned in a country where everybody's in line, in the same line of thought, and cooperate in the or interact, whereby the media is controlled by the state and speaks what the state presents, or where media diversity in media is a great richness of our political and public stage. For your information, politics does not have to be united, or media does not have to be united, but they have to be professional, namely to verify the information, to go to the fundamentals of journalism, to seek the truth. We need variety of voices in medial stage, but also in terms of politics. I will give myself the right to give a political opinion. We need more political diversity in order to have unification, or these are narratives of the mark of public sphere, but the competition in media is very sound and it is even encouraged. And in Kosovo, there is a law regulating this, namely, media has to be competitive, and there is a prohibition of concentrating media to a single business, for example. In this regard, it's not that Kosovo is in a very bad situation. This is what I could add. Thank you a bit. Do we have time for another question, or we concluded? All right, since we do not have additional time, I would like to thank all the panelists, Arta, Abit, and Victor. I hope that we will have other opportunities to discuss about this topic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Valon. Thank you, all panelists. We saw the findings of the research of NDI, and we heard the discussion how Kosovo is dealing with information disorder, namely disinformation, misinformation, language of hatred. Now we will listen to stories which relate to analyzing these phenomena and dealing with them. Now we will hear the story of Gran Gerguri, who is a lecturer in the journalist department at the University of Pristina, Hassan Pristina, and editor in European Journalist Observatorium. Dren will share with the public his experience in addressing disinformation in Kosovo and academic viewpoints in this regard. Dren, I invite you to the stage. Thank you, Adea. Greetings to all of you. I am Dren Gerguri, an experienced journalist and lecturer in the journalist department at the University of Pristina. I will describe a personal story of mine from the previous years, in the period where everybody distributed disinformation without verifying them, with the idea of helping the others to protect from COVID, for example. Here in the chart, I listed the top 5 disinformation regarding COVID-19, something I worked on last year, interaction of disinformation, and I came up with a list of top 5 disinformation that have had more interaction in Albanian language, because we had a proliferation of disinformation not only from a Facebook page of Kosovo, but also Albania and Albanians from North Macedonia. In this top 5 list, I selected the third one, and the reason being that the third one, for the first time, I received from a friend of mine. He sent it to me to Viber, and he said, "Look at this news and to see how to find out whether you are affected or not." A Japanese doctor says, hold your breath for 10 seconds. If after 10 seconds you don't have problems with breathing, then you are not infected. And then I ask him, where did you get this news? He says, on internet. Once you say on internet, it's just like saying, were you on leave? Yes. Where were you? At seaside. So no specificity regarding the source you used. The second question I asked was, who is this Japanese doctor? He said, I don't know, but he's a Japanese. He's probably a knowledgeable person since he's from Japan. So the second issue that have to be aware of is we have to know who said it when we analyze media content, whatever that may be. In this case, there was no name. And even if there was a name, we have to check who that person is, to take his name and to Google it. If he is an expert, as claimed, you will find it on Google, also from other sources that support it. The reason I said this was that this was the most credible news, whereby an American doctor, Rashid Butar, in the text translated into Albanian language, he is described as a doctor, prestigious doctor, but when you go to American media, you will see that that is not the case. So we have to be cautious as to who that person is. What I always prefer to discuss with others when we discuss about disinformation, the scholars in general provided up to 10 steps that we have to follow in order to identify disinformation. But imagine in today's dynamics to take 10 steps in order to disclose disinformation. This is something that requires a lot of time. So once somebody mentions 10 steps, we just don't do it. So what I tried to do through this model was to provide something that is shorter, but at the same time, it incorporates all these key elements that you have to seek in a certain article. The first question is the source credible? So the news that we get, is this source of information credible? So before trusting any kind of information, we have to start with a dose of skepticism, with some questions, and eliminating them. If the source is credible, then we remove a certain question mark, and then we go to the next question. It doesn't mean that the fact was that this source is credible. It does not generate disinformation, because we have many cases that even the media that we consider that would never publish disinformation, they actually failed. Then secondly, we want to see if this information was broadcast by another media. So it's impossible to find that information only on one Facebook page, for example, because Facebook is social media used to a large extent by our society, and not only by the young people, because sometimes we think that young people are only on Facebook, but other age groups of society spend lots of time on Facebook, and very often especially the elderly, they fall prey of manipulation, thinking that what is posted on Facebook is true. And so you have to check if this news was reported by another media. If not, then take it, but have your reserves. If if it was broadcast by another online by another medium, then we want to know if it was reported, if this news was reported in another media. Last year, for example, we discussed about the vaccine for pandemics, whereby lots of efforts were made to produce a vaccine. So for vaccine, I said we have to wait, but we have infodemia, so let's try to protect ourselves from this vastness of disinformation in media. And in the case of official sources, be that National Institute of Public Health of Kosovo, Ministry of Health, experts of the field which are considered official news, official sources of news. If you see somebody speaking about COVID, but he does not have medical background, that is not a supportive source. Because we had such cases in Kosovo where people who have nothing to do with medicine came out publicly saying that COVID does not exist, and to an extent, this affected a number of citizens who said that, you see, the COVID does not exist because it was mentioned by this person. So the conviction that you have about certain thing, if you come across a certain disinformation, you will believe it. If it's contrary to it, then you will refuse it because you do not like what you're reading. So this is what I prepared briefly about what I wanted to share with you today. Of course, I'm open to any questions that you may have with what I just presented, but also about disinformation, misinformation, which is one of my most preferred fields since I've been dealing with them since 2016, and not only after COVID pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gunguri. We've heard some authentic stories from Dren Gunguri, and we got some advice and the steps that we have to follow to distinguish disinformation. We will now proceed with a second story. Now we have Nina Yankovic, who is an associate on issues of disinformation in the Wilson Center, who also advised the Ukrainian government under the grant for public financing by Fulbright Clinton. Yankovic is also an author of the book How to Lose the War of Information, Russia, Fake News, and the Future Conflict. So now she will join us virtually and will share with us her experience in analyzing and reviewing disinformation. We'll just wait a minute until Nina is connected.
Yankovic. I'm the author of How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. And I study disinformation, and I am a National Democratic Institute alumna. I am so pleased to be with you here today and tell you my DISICON story. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the most interesting things in my own personal experiences intersected with my study of disinformation. In 2016 and 2017, I was working as a strategic communications advisor to the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine. And in my spare time, before I went to Ukraine, I used to do musical theater, participating in local theater productions and dealing with a lot of amazing, unique people in the Washington, D.C. area who liked to do the same. In July 2017, I was a few weeks away from moving back to the United States, and a funny ad came up for me on Facebook advertising a flash mob outside of the White House on July 4th, 2017. It was calling for theater people in the Washington area to show up dressed like Revolutionary War people and sing songs from the musical Les Miserables in front of the White House, demanding President Trump's impeachment. I thought this was pretty funny. At that time, a lot of Americans were finding unique ways to protest on both sides of the political spectrum. And I filed the incident away as something curious that I had seen online and didn't think about it for many, many months later. In October 2018, I was getting off of a transatlantic flight, when I was turning my phone on after many hours away, and I started getting all of these messages about a new criminal complaint that had been unsealed as part of the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. People were asking for my analysis, and so on the cab ride home, I was leafing through the complaint on my phone, really enlarging that tiny text, when one detail stood out to me. In that complaint, it said that the Internet Research Agency, the famous troll factory in St. Petersburg, had funded a flash mob outside of the White House in which people sang songs from the musical Les Miserables in Washington, D.C. on July 4th, 2017. I was shocked. It seemed that someone from the Internet Research Agency had spent $80 on Facebook ads in order to get that flash mob to the widest possible audience. And that was when I knew I had to look into this incident further. So I called up one of the organizers of the flash mob, at least according to the internet, to the parts of the flash mob, the evidence from the flash mob that was still online. Facebook had removed a lot of it. And I got in touch with Ryan Clayton, who led a group called Americans Take Action. They had been involved with some really creative protests around the Washington, D.C. area since Trump won the election in November of 2016. And when I wrote to Ryan and he got on the phone with me, he told me, you know what, I had no idea who I was dealing with. Neither did any of my other co-organizers. And we met for coffee in November of 2018, just before the midterm elections. And he told me the story of the flash mob. Again, his group had been doing really flashy protests around Washington. This was another one in that long line of flashy protests. They were working with other progressive groups in the Washington political scene to put it on. And one of them had received a message on Facebook that said, hey, I've got $80 on my Facebook ad account. Do you want it to promote your event? And Ryan said to me, well, of course I wanted it, because we're a progressive organization and we operate in institutional poverty. And as long as you aren't politicians for killing puppies, we're going to take your money. They had no idea that they were dealing with a Russian national situated in St. Petersburg at the Internet Research Agency. And he doesn't know if it was because of the advertising or because it was such a unique protest, but it was their most successful protest ever. And Ryan was really surprised that his group, a progressive group, a group that theoretically would be against the Trump presidency that Russia had supported in its interference in the 2016 election, a group that was against Russian interference in American politics, that they would be supported by the Internet Research Agency. But we talked it through, and I told him, you know, Russia's campaigns are very focused on individuals. They are focused on amplifying the polarization and the fissures in our society. So it makes total sense that we would see, on the one hand, the Internet Research Agency and other Russian entities supporting conservatives in the Trump campaign. And on the other hand, we would see them supporting progressive organizations that were trying to go against the Trump presidency and the Trump administration. And Ryan said to me, that makes a lot of sense. When you weight the sides of the fabric of society, you can tear it apart. And that is the real kernel of disinformation. That is the truth of disinformation. We often hear it referred to as fake news, but in reality, there is truth and emotion at the core of disinformation. It deals with people's real fears and grievances in society. Russia doesn't make up fake narratives, neither does China or Iran or any other actor in the disinformation space. They amplify what's already there, and they use technologies like social social media, like information laundering, using friendly media outlets in order to distance themselves from disinformation narratives, in order to get those narratives out in the public sphere to the people who are going to be most vulnerable to them. And that's why journalists in particular have such a huge role to play, not only in making sure they're reporting the truth and vetting their information and raising awareness of disinformation and its effects on our society, our democracy, our national security, but also because disinformation is inherently human and inherently personal. So the more that we can tell stories that resonate with people, that speak to their true experiences, the better we're going to be able to fight disinformation. We want to have a counter narrative toward disinformation. We want to counter the brand of disinformation. We want to make sure that we are offering something in democracy that is an alternative to the lies, to the fabrications that disinformation has. And so journalists obviously can do all of that through their reporting, but we can also focus on educating people through informational and media literacy, making sure that people know how they're being manipulated on social media, that they know that the most engaging content on social media is often the most enraging or emotional content. We need to educate people so that they know they need to take care before they share, and that they are the front lines of disinformation. They are the ones that are on the front lines of the information war. Because if we all take a little bit of extra time to verify our sources, to wonder who we're talking to, who's buying those ads for us, to think about how we might be being manipulated, then we really have a chance at winning the information war. And there are a lot of examples in my own experience in Europe that are really, truly effective ways to counter disinformation. Great media literacy programs in places like Ukraine, where now media literacy is part of the curriculum in secondary schools. In Finland, where media literacy is taught from kindergarten on up. In Estonia, where it's not just about media and information literacy, but where the Estonian government is reaching out to Russian speakers and making sure that they are acquainted with Estonian language, Estonian culture, and that they have the career opportunities, the educational opportunities necessary so that their grievances of being de facto second-class citizens in Estonia are obliterated, that they have the same opportunities as ethnic Estonians. That was what the Russian campaign focused on, pulling society in Estonia apart by those ethnic differences, and the Estonian government is trying to knit them back together. So if there's one thing you leave with today, it's that we are all part of this struggle. This isn't something just for the tech companies, just for the government, just for the media to do. We each have an individual responsibility. And unless we fulfill that responsibility, disinformation is going to continue to be effective. And all we need to show that is that you're not necessarily protected from disinformation just because you're a certain ethnicity, a certain political group, or, you know, in America versus Europe. All of those are clearly vulnerabilities that can be manipulated by the right actor. So let's all be on guard. Let's take care before we share, and let's continue to bring truth to light in all of our work. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and share my DISA story with you today. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
E falenderojmë Nina Janković, ndau me ne këtë rrëfim mjaft interesant si dhe pikpamjet e saj se si t'ja bëjmë, si t'i luftojmë.
Thank you for this information. Thank you to all the speakers. We'll go now to a quick 10-minute break to come back to the second panel of this first day of the DISICON conference. Stay tuned.
Acum ca Mircea Tiaci. Acum ca Mircea tu Burbaliu. Čajo. A ne prete vojne.
So greetings. We are coming back to the second part of the DISICON conference for the information integrity. Now we will have the panelists who will discuss about the online disinformation and social media in Kosovo, who will discuss about the information disorder, language of hatred, sexist language, which are present in media, online media, but also in social media. Our panelists are Mr. Luan Latifi, chief editor in the Independent Journalists Association, Imer Mushkolej. Welcome, Mr. Imer. Gentiana Begoli, president of the Board of Association of Journalists of Kosovo. Welcome, Gentiana. And Krishni Goshi, chief editor of BIN and author of Decia in Kosovo TV show. We will start the discussion by highlighting the research of NDI, which indicate a considerable presence of fake information, distorted information, or partial information in the Kosovo environment. I will start with you, Mr. Latifi, from your perspective, and highlighting also the institutional perspective. What is the situation in Kosovo? To what extent is Kosovo endangered by the disinformation? I cannot hear the speaker. Now it's okay. I represent KPM. I have to highlight that the legal mandate for monitoring and analyzing online media whereby the disinformation is present to a large extent, as highlighted by the report presented by Mr. Vallon, TVs, radios, and those media which are part of licensing by independent media committee are in much better position in terms of reporting. There could be some reporting where all stakeholders are not included and similar things, but based on our monitoring of these media, we did not come across any serious violation that could endanger the democracy in the country. Regarding portals, there is their dominance in social networks, but also portals that provide various articles whereby disinformation is present to a large extent. The possibility of verifying such news is very difficult, especially by the random citizens. That's why we as KPM found it important to deal with the relaxation of receiving such information, namely creating an interinstitutional platform that deals with media education. In this regard, it would be good to involve all stakeholders, starting from independent media commission, various journalists, civil society organizations, which would promote media education and awareness raising of citizens, since for us it's very important for citizens to become educated in knowing understanding the portal, the media, the truthfulness of the news, which is based on the journalism standards of journalism. This is my initial comment regarding the created situation. There is a directive of whereby we aspire to amend the law on KPM. I know that Imer will disagree with me, but it is a EU requirement whereby platforms posting video through internet, namely Facebook and other platforms that provide audio visual media, to be under the mandate of the KPM regulation. I will not provide the details as I'm not certain of such details as to how this regulation will take place, but taking into account the dominance and the impact on public opinion, the form of distribution programs through internet, I personally consider that there is a need for putting these platforms under the auspices of KPM. This is a EU requirement, not exclusively requirement of KPM, because this will be additional burden for us, but for us it is also priority to protect the citizens from fake news. Now, Mr. Mushkole, regarding the presence of disinformation and misinformation in online media in Kosovo and portals. Thank you, Adea. When we mention online media in Kosovo, usually we are mentioning them as portals, which is a problem in itself because we have to take into account that not all online addresses are media. First and foremost, not everything that is online is media. Not that everything is online is information portal. On the other hand, not everything that is on Facebook, which has the name, let's say, X newspaper, is actually a newspaper. For example, a certain newspaper which has 100,000 followers, which publishes news and which we as readers beyond institutions, we don't know who is behind such a newspaper. So that's why we have to to make a distinction between what is media and what is not. In Kosovo, there are many online portals, news portals, which are a genuine media in terms of their functioning, of their ownership, registration in a competent authority, in the sense of having an editorial board and transparency. But also there is a large number of so-called media which are not media because they do not meet any of these requirements. In our independent council, we incorporate the media from the first group, namely, we know who they are, what they broadcast, and even when they have problems in the way they report or disinform, or inform or disinform, we know the address, or the parties know who to address to. For example, on Facebook, a so-called media which calls itself a media, but which is nothing more than a Facebook account, could broadcast anything. We, as association, but also as institution, we are incompetent to deal with such issue because we do not know who stands behind it. This has nothing to do with media ethics, with media professionalism in terms of recommendation or intervention, but we are dealing here with purely criminal thing because somebody is using online platform in order to disinform the public. Secondly, another problem is the issue as to what we understand with disinformation as far as the fake news are concerned, because it is difficult to assess what news is a completely fake news or news that have problems with the way they were reported. In our council, based on the code of ethics, all these problems that the media have in reporting, we include them in the chapter reporting the truth. And the problems that we come across, which are not small ones, because usually there are large problems, we consider them part of reporting the truth. On the other hand, those pieces of news, for example, 2 days ago, we heard that Miroshka Barshi had died. So fake news right from the beginning was distributed, and even the serious media fell prey of such fake news. They took the bait of such fake news. Luan highlighted the issue of certain monitoring. I will not call it control, monitoring of online content. KPM is a constitutional body, and the Media Council is a self-regulatory body, which are similar to other bodies in the region and in Europe. This means that printed media and online media make efforts to self-regulate regarding the way they function. Currently, part of the council are 50 online medias, not only in Albanian but also in Serbian and other languages. They were also part, newspapers were also, printed media were also part of this. Unfortunately, none of the printed media exist. They exist online, and they are part of the council. The council functions with the idea of taking decisions based on the complaints coming from various stakeholders, namely heads of institutions. For example, last month there was a complaint by the president of the country, all the way to the businesses, various NGOs, and regular citizens. We've we've been dealing continuously with journalists, with media, and with the passage of time, the awareness of people regarding the content of online media is increasing, because we have situations when the citizens who are not at all part of reporting or not party in the reporting, they complain because they see that a certain online reporting something is missing. There were cases when the council even took the initiative to decide on a certain matter ex officio, regardless if there was a complaint or not. Luan said regarding the TV and radio, there are smaller problems. This is how they evaluate it. But the same TV and radio, they have their online versions. So we face problems with the online versions of the same TV and radio stations, whereby they do not have due diligence on online platform. So there were two complaints from regarding two TV stations in Kosovo. Usually such complaints are initially addressed to us, whereby a certain story is produced in the news and then transferred to the portals of certain TV. So we orient them to the KPM, because the first source is the TV. Because in the past we had situations when in KPM, but also in our console, this complaint was addressed, and we had difficulties in identifying the responsibilities. So this is a practice that, with the passage of time, we set up, whereby the complaints that are addressed to TVs will be referred to KPM, and we will deal with the online media. Another issue regarding the decisions made, we do not have a mechanism to punish or to issue sanctions to media. I mean, we do not have mechanisms to execute a certain punishment or sanction, but with the decision that we make relate to the ethics, and then we refer the parties to follow their cases at the court, for example, or to observe the law on slander and infamy. Very often, the courts ask the council to produce the decision, since there is not a large number of judges and prosecutors who have sufficient information to deal with cases related to media. Let's not forget that media are quite specific regarding the way they function, the way they report, issues of privacies, and it's not that easy to decide on these matters. So we try to give our support also in this regard. So when it comes to the decision making, the courts will find it easier to produce a meritorious decision. Thank you, Imer. Now, Ms. Gentiana Begoli, we heard the previous speakers about the main problems of online media, but also social media, and I'm making this distinction. And also Mr. Latifi regarding the TVs. So where do journalists stand? Where is their position? We saw lots of development in the recent decades. So what is the position of the journalists in Kosovo? Where do they find themselves in problems?
Firstly, thank you for inviting me to discuss about this topic that's of great concern to all of us, and it's difficult to follow your distinguished panelists. But on the other hand, they've said a lot. When we speak about journalists, Mr. Latif and Mr. Mushkoli spoke about the powers and competences and responsibilities, and the press council and the IMC are separate institutions, but they have the common objective. When it comes to the fake news, which is the central topic of this discussion, is difficult to elaborate. Where do journalists stand here, and where do the owners stand? Now, I've been working as a journalist for 20 years now, and when we look at the situation with the pandemic, for example, the first case of the infection was a year ago. So basically, you can count with your fingers the fake news. The fake news regarding the pandemic for a year was only a handful, but when it comes to the fake news regarding the election campaign, we see hundreds and thousands of cases. Basically, I'm trying to say that it's not the journalists cannot do their jobs, but unfortunately, there are a lot of media who try to push their agendas through their journalists. I think Mr. Khorasani also uh, said something like this in his elaboration. It's not that there's a lack of professionalism, but there's an issue of intent, an issue of interests of owners of the media. Valen also mentioned earlier that the radio and TV had fewer cases of fake news, whereas online portals much more than that. I think there's something important here, because when you look at the stories that appear in portals, we see that in very few of them, we see the author of the story of the piece. In TV and radio, it's easily verifiable, but usually they put it. Whereas in online media, more often than not, there are articles, stories with no authorship. Nobody knows who wrote them, who pushed them, and the answer is simple: those who stand behind editorial policies made them write them to protect certain interests, whether commercial, political, or otherwise. And we know that in the vast majority of the media, there are strong economic groups that became very powerful by being connected with the politics. I don't think the journalists do not know how to do their job. I took the example of the pandemic. It's been a year and more that we're dealing with this. And remember, we were forced, when it comes to the pandemic, we were forced to report on the numbers daily, the statistics, the numbers of deaths and infections. On the other hand, we have another type of pandemic and we have a pandemic that even the WHO has its dilemmas about. And on the other hand, we have election campaigns with real politicians, and we have so much fake news about facts where that are easily verifiable. Whether when it comes to the pandemic situation, which is a complex issue, even for the WHO, there are fewer pieces of fake news, and I think that this is a clear indicator that the media today, unfortunately, is facing. In fact, reporters, journalists are afraid of losing their jobs and who are more concerned about the interests rather than something else. For the 20 years that I've been involved in this profession, it's the worst time for the credibility of journalists now. I know that the journalists face a significant pressure from owners. I know the conditions that they work in. I know that their monthly salary is still at the level of 150 to 200 euros a day. And the stories that are just copy pasted are only there to protect an interest. Uh, uh, I also feel very bad that I was not here to follow Drengarguri's topic, but I'm pleased that you have discussed the issue of how to protect this little credibility that is remaining here. I heard Ambassador Kosnet, who said that if citizens do not believe the reporters, the journalists, who can they believe? I agree 100% with that. We see a loss of trust in journalism for the only reason that we don't know who is behind the portals, who stands behind them, who finances them. And I think that the key issue to discuss here is how to find a way to protect the credibility of journalists and strengthen the work of journalists and the trust on them. And absolutely, media literacy is a key element here. As a teenager, I remember that when a woman was attacked in two municipalities of Kosovo by a group of teenagers, and I don't. And there was a huge issue, and I know that nothing was done to work with those teens, with those children, with other teens in Kosovo to work on media literacy. Let me stop here and
Po pajtohemi që dezinformimi dhe keqinformimi
we agree that disinformation and misinformation is challenging. Gentiana mentioned the professionalism and the independence of the media, so let me put this out there for discussion. Okay, the first element that I want to avoid is by distinguishing the TV and radio as media with no problems, because we have to just look at the number of complaints in the IMC and the press council and see how many complaints are approved by from portals and those in the IMC. And when we look at the results, the outcomes, there's not much difference really. in terms of numbers of complaints approved, is virtually the same. So it's not that we have only with online portals. There are problems with TVs and with TV audiences. But here there's another concerning data, and that's the fact that the citizens of Kosovo have become more aware about the quality of the content produced online, and the final measurements now indicate that they are again going back to the TV, and the main source of information is the TV. And we need more analytical analysis as to what content is being produced in TVs, in televisions, and what quality it adheres to. And when I speak about online media, I speak about members of the press councils. I'm not talking about Facebook profiles. I'm not talking about websites of companies that are registered under dubious names and whatnot. But I think that the debate should revolve around what is being presented by TV and radio, and to analyze that content and to see whether there is a mismatch between what we call truth, because journalists and editors and the media should only be interested in the truth and in facts. I am an editor in calzo.com, and we are the only medium licensed by IFCN to do fact checking. I hope that there will be more media in Kosovo that will manage this standard. But at any point when I see reportings in the media, I see that we have many issues. Firstly, we have problems by giving the other party the chance to respond to the arguments, and we have problems with ignoring certain facts and just going ahead with an information which then becomes a disinformation and fake news. What I want to say here is that we oftentimes listen to politicians who have been amnestied from defamation. The MPs are immune from defamation lawsuits, and journalists, knowing that what the MP has said is a libel, a defamation, they continue to post it, to present it. What should be the work of a journalist is to go and to tell the citizens that this is not true, and it has to be denounced. But this is not picked up, and it remains a statement in a committee, parliamentary committee, or wherever it was made, and the media continue to just portray it and share it. Of course, the analysis that we're trying to do to analyze this area are plentiful, and Mr. Latifi mentioned something interesting, and I definitely would want to live in a country that could control the TikTok content, but that there will be no country of that, and we will not manage to develop a law on the press council and on media content. But what's relevant and what's important is that the best solution to resolve the problem of disinformation and fake news is to educate the problem as to how to read online, how to receive an information, how to have people understand what's going on with information. No, we no longer have the culture that whatever the news has printed, that is the truth. We have managed to tear down the normal editorial processes. Most online media now work without editors or only with a single editor, and it's unfortunate that TVs are only going to the direction of having only one editor for a news edition and news desk, and it's impossible for one person to check 30 minutes of news per day. But the fact is that there is a lower number of editors, and just look at how much is being edited really. Now, one may ask, why is this happening to us, and what's the purpose of all this? Firstly, we have the investments ongoing in our media, investments in media coming from Albania, and who who actually require a thorough analysis as to why they're coming in Kosovo and why certain companies are investing in the media in Kosovo. And on the other hand, we have to see at the profits from views and clicks and whatnot. I think that ultimately the consequences will be paid by citizens. I was personally with the police when we apprehended a person for writing a comment on a social network on Facebook, and his reply to the police was very simple. I did not know that I can go to jail for writing something on Facebook. We have 30 people accused of terrorism because they wrote messages who are considered as terroristic on Facebook. And do you know what they said, these people, when they went to the court? We did not know that saying something on Facebook has the same weight as if saying it in person. This indicates a lack of knowledge, lack of information about the responsibility for writing online. I think that the solution is to work with the Ministry of Education and other partners. The problem is when owners of the media, editors of the media, intentionally provoke a society which is fairly uneducated and who easily fall in these traps. And you can see this being done with pictures and with a call to action, comment, and whatnot. We have media who are members of the press council who have banned the comments section. This is because of a decision that we've taken in the press council. But what has happened? We've shifted the commenting to social media, Facebook and whatnot, and the media there have forgot about a mechanism, a tool that this social network offers. Well, they could just go in and ban swear words, offensive language. Most do not do this. In calzo.com, we have 1,500 words that we have banned. You cannot use because their comment will be deleted automatically. But these others decide not to go ahead with that, not because they want only clicks and views. And so this brings us to a situation where the consequences will be felt by people. We have people who have been punished because they commented on Facebook. We have people who went to jail because of this. And citizens now have to be told that there are such problems and issues. Another problem that we still see and identify, and we do not know still how we got it, is that we don't have content that is produced in Kosovo, translated in Kosovo, and we don't know who financed that. I don't know who wakes up in the morning and translates the information about what Erdogan has done. We don't have content that shows what Putin has done. I don't know which editor or journalist in Kosovo has an interest to do such translation. We don't know who pays for that information and who would really be interested in that. It's not something that would generate clicks as so much so to pay for the salary of a journalist. Just think about it. Most of us have created this illusion that the benefit from social networks come from clicks, but Kosovo is not one of the countries that earns a lot from clicks, from views. Except when our diaspora gets in. So somebody has to finance the production of 100 or 200 news items, and so we need mechanisms to tell us where is this financing coming from. Where is financing coming from? It should have been an interesting topic for us journalists ourselves. 30 million euros have come from the Post of Kosovo and was spread to 120 portals at a time when there were only 25 members in the press council. So public money has went to portals which spread fake news. Today, we have no criteria to tell us that the media that get funds from the government, that are paid from the government, that even have sponsored content from the government, to firstly be members of the press council, and secondly, not to violate the code of ethics dozens of times. I don't think there will be media who would not violate the code of ethics at least once, because this happens to even New York Times. But a media outlet that violates the code of ethics 30 times straight and to get public funds from marketing and from public companies, but that's not normal. What have we done is we have paid our own taxpayers' monies to finance a machinery that generates fake news, which favor the politics and certain groups of politicians. Why does this happen, and what should be our target? Political parties in Kosovo, we all know that they have a guaranteed fund from the state of Kosovo, and that's the only fund that is audited. And so we, who work in the media, but also our colleagues, know that political parties, they pay for media coverage in cash payments, and we need to research this and to measure this. Who's financing all these ads? How are they being paid for? Such an analysis would bring us to a situation where we would know where is money coming from and why a certain medium is getting a position from a political party, and which is not the end of the world. But the problem is with the silent stand of support of a political party by those who try to stay behind and manipulate the situation. We need a mechanism. We need to ignite a discussion to come up with answers as to why such news gets here. Political parties do not tell us how much they spend in the media per year. They do not tell us how many people in their political party offices are employed with regards to public information. Because there are many productions from offices of political parties, but they appear as if they were regular, impartial media. One final remark, and I think Emer would agree. I am also a member of the Press Council, and we have a huge discussion there about our capacity in the Press Council to finance our work and to have a funding source to monitor the online content, a capacity and a and an authorization that we don't have according to the laws in Kosovo. Another problematic issue is that other than saying that they are newspapers and mediums, we have now this new euphoria to become fact checkers, and we have portals and initiatives appearing as fact checkers. But in order to do that job, to be able to do that, they should at least be members of the Press Council, or to have a license as we do in Kalza.com. And I will conclude with saying that the trends will go towards a direction that, in addition to producing information, they will now see a potential in fact-checking organizations, and it's a challenge because we will now have fake news produced with a fact-checking stamp, and that is something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much for the very important discussion regarding the information disorder, and we will continue the conversation in this regard with Mr. Mushkola. What are the reasons behind information disorder in media environment, namely increase in presence and distribution of misinformation and disinformation? Most of the reasons were already mentioned. Of course, here we are talking about fake news, disinformation, but unfortunately, we are all witnesses that in addition to fake news in Kosovo, there is so-called fake media. So we are talking about the media which are false, inexistent, and as I said at the beginning, they do not meet a single requirement for being media, and they have various intentions, political, party. They can operate within a period of time. For example, during the election campaign, there can be a certain Facebook page. A few days ago, I came across such page which was created in 2008. Namely, it was created in 2008, And for example, its name was John Smith, and then with the passage of years, like 4 years later, it turned into newspaper John Smith, and sometime later, John Smith was removed, and instead Daily was inserted. And on 14th of February, it further changed the name Daily, and it constantly produced fake news for a certain political party, certain individuals. So we can see how these pages on Facebook, with the passing of time, they are converted into something very significant in terms of distribution of information. Because this certain case had 50,000 followers, even though the information distributed was fake news, and whereby certain political names are lynched or political parties are lynched. But there are other so-called media which have an impact on information disorder or for business purpose. For example, there are lots of media or so-called media, because as I defined what are considered media or not. So in order to promote a certain business, they sell a certain content which is prohibited by our code. We know the sponsoring in terms of advertisements, but beyond this, Krishnik highlighted the issue of financing from public funds. And for majority of them, when we saw the list published in media and produced by Telecom back then, we never heard of such people who created such portals, who were close relatives to politicians, sister of certain minister, cousin of a certain MP. So it was sufficient for them to register as such in the business registration agency, to take that money and then to shut down the businesses. Because the purpose of existence of such media was not to inform the public, but to generate thousands of euros, which were given to a certain politician or businessman who was related to politics. Furthermore, during the political campaigns, during the election campaigns, the political parties financed such portals in order to generate their propaganda. The way it was financed, it was in a completely different manner, because you cannot finance regularly a certain medium which is not registered at all in certain competent authority and calls itself media. So politics and business, in my opinion, are two not guilty parties, but the main reasons why this way of disinformation is taking place, or how this rise in disinformation. And this also relates to other factors. I just wanted to highlight one more thing briefly regarding the content that we consume every day. Of course, it is very difficult for the citizens, for example, when they are told not to consume something which they consider fake news. So this looks difficult for them, but we have to highlight this continuously, because if a certain portal or a platform that you liked on Facebook disinformed you once, twice, 3 times, then why do you keep it on your phone? I've been doing this for several months now. I'm in the media council, but not even our members are on my phone. I have only those medias which I consider that they do not violate, because it's impossible not to make a certain violation once in a while, but they don't do it frequently. So this is a kind of education that we have to pass out to the public, because I'm convinced that all of us here, including me, unawares, have a certain platform that 5 years ago I liked, and I get certain information which is fake, even though I did not do it consciously. But so we have to start from ourselves as a community of journalists and media. And I'm referring to mainstream media, mainstream journalists, so that we can pass this on to the public. But it's impossible to exclude the public into this discussion, into this undertaking. Today, public cannot remain indifferent and take it for granted any content coming from online media, TV, or radio. The media education or literacy was mentioned by all of you. What do you think, Mr. Latif? What is the role of media in educating citizens and in raising the awareness specifically regarding disinformation? Regarding taking into account the impact of media, if we look at the positive aspects, because we mentioned many fake news, fake portals, so it is necessary to activate media for media literacy or media education. One of the forms of media literacy is for Kosovo public is to educate the citizens, not only the minors, the children, but also the elderly. Ireland has a very well developed platform and it's working very well in this regard because we do not know, because the citizen is free to take a certain portal. Perhaps somebody is entertained with fake news and they have another medium where they obtain the true news. So it is good for all institutions to work in this aspect. Civil society organizations, media, journalists. We have sporadic activities. Imer was involved in the programs of media literacy, but it's good to develop this into institutional platform so that we can distribute proper information, proper knowledge that have further impact on the education of citizens. Raising the awareness of citizens, I have a personal experience of mine. Several years ago, I was part of monitoring and during a study visit in Afghan, England, with my counterparts there, I asked whether they monitor certain radio in certain part of England. Do you monitor their content? And they said, we don't understand you. And perhaps he did not understand me in English. And then when I repeated, he said, I do understand, but why should we monitor it? We have the citizens there. If a certain radio or TV produces fake news outside the journalist standards, it will shut down itself. So it is very important to raise the awareness of people in this environment whereby the fake news, disinformation do not have place in our media landscape. It's not easy, but I believe that we have lots of good journalists. We have very good media representatives, and I will not include the state one, but we can contribute to pushing this commitment further. But again, I will go back to the need for amending the law. It is an urgent matter. The law on independent media commission should ensure independence in decision making, financial independence, and so that it will remain regulatory media authority. The media, this country needs a powerful regulatory body with the support of media and journalism. We agree that the changes should start from media and journalists. Now I would like to discuss the role of journalists in fighting these information disorders, namely disinformation and misinformation, since one of them aims to produce damage and the other may be a result of a lack of professionalism. Zata, what is your opinion? What is the role of Kosovo journalists in fighting disinformation in our media landscape? Earlier we discussed about how we have to educate the people and how we start educating ourselves first, but let's not forget one of the key factors in educating the people is the role of media. I don't want to sound skeptical, but the situation is not that we could say that easily we could say that this is the solution. What we did as association with many international partners, including NDI, to which we are always grateful, is always to speak with our colleagues as to how we should work in conformity with the ethics, what we should do, which should be our priorities, how should we behave in this difficult times for journalism. But again, I will go back to the beginning of my presentation. The comparison that I made with the pandemics and the election campaign indicates best that we are not dealing with unprofessional journalists, but businesses, various business groups and political groups which orient media toward their agenda, be that for material gains or political gains. So in Kosovo, media has converted into business. A large part of media through journalism, they tried to convert medium into business, and then consequently through such business which is not media to push their agendas forward. I don't know, to tell you the truth, as I said earlier, we cannot seek education of citizens when we ourselves don't know how to educate ourselves. How can we stop or prevent our colleagues? How can we prevent a certain medium? We are to blame as well. We had numerous conferences where representatives of several media were present, but very rarely did we face a certain reporting of one media against another media to see what professional crime they are committing. Because in a way, the bad thing is highlighted in isolated conferences, in coffee bars. A certain journalist is criticized, a certain media is criticized, but I've never seen anyone publicly fighting a certain wrongdoing, which is further affecting the people. So, to what extent we, as representatives of media or owners of media, can we say that people should be educated when we take a large part in such education? I'm 38 years old and I work throughout the weekend, and then I decide to go and visit my parents in pay. I work as a representative of journalists of Kosovo. I take interviews in the capacity of journalist in the Kosovo medium. I face lots of problems within Kosovo medium. I follow lots of news. I am updated it throughout the time. And then my mother says, "My girl, you are wrong because my neighbor said this." And then when I take her phone, I see numerous clicks of pages which are very, very disturbing. So going back to this big problem that we as media face, and we have to find a solution how to first and foremost educate ourselves, and then jointly see what we can do to educate other more vulnerable categories, and to see where we stand. Yes, the same question to Mr. Mushkolai, if you don't mind. We have to, Mr. Garcia has to leave earlier. So, Mr. Mushkola, what is the role of journalists in fighting disinformation? The problem is not only with journalists, but also other communities, is the hesitation to point the finger at the black sheep. This is a problem because usually there is this kind of solidarity. You saw it in politics, business, where a certain medium or journalist is not doing his or her job properly, and for that reason, as our proverb says, everybody is put in the same bag. So, for example, today in Kosovo, there is this common saying that all journalists lie, all media lie. So there is this public discourse. Kreshnik highlighted earlier the importance of platforms that deconstruct news. I believe that one of the beneficial commitment of media would be precisely this, namely powerful platforms that deconstruct fake news. When I say platform, I refer to platforms that have staff that do their job professionally in order to bring to the surface, namely to inform the public what is fake and what is true. Antore joined us just now. He's one of the individuals who tries to do his job in his organization, namely to deconstruct the news, particularly the Facebook pages that we discussed earlier, and which truly are pose a great problem. And I'm not saying that the media which are part of the council don't face problems. They do. Otherwise, the council would not exist. But the good thing is that nevertheless, these media know each other. They discuss about, we discuss serving as mediator without having the complaints coming to the council. So it's not the issue of what journalists should do. Yes, journalists, but together with media. But then it's very important to see how this chain of journalist, media, chief editor, owner works. So it is true what Kreshnik said, that lots of online media, especially the small ones, do not have editors. There is no chain of control of information. A certain journalist who is a rookie in his or her job, he or she decides to publish something without going through a certain filter, which was not a case when we had printed media. We all worked actively in newspapers, and we saw how this chain works. Adena, if there is a question for me from the audience, please. Otherwise, then Kreshnik is here, who is member of the council, and he can also answer about other matters related to the work of the council. Yes, if there is a question from the audience for Mr. Mushkola, since he has to leave earlier. Yes, we face with fake news on daily basis, with incomplete news, with news that we know that are not true, but nevertheless they do not remove the like, or they don't unlike, but they continue consuming the same content which is not professional. Thank you, Mr. Mushkola. Apparently there is no question. Or Mr. Hoja? Çadıpak. Just to contribute, we are trying to do what we can do, So regarding the topic of COVID-19, I have to highlight that the fake news regarding COVID-19, if they are reported and we identify within 24 hours, we remove them from the Facebook. So it's been a year now. We are very satisfied with the serious media, with media which are registered in the independent media commission. It's not that there were not shortcomings, that there were no mistakes, but as I said earlier today, and I will reiterate, based on what we monitor on a daily basis, the biggest risk are the non-serious media. So when you have serious media, you have an address where to complain. You have a regulatory authority with which in its capacities is doing its job to some extent. So there is an address where you can file your complaint, and then you can further your case even to the court. But we have a large number of medias and social media which are not registered at all. They are not in the cybernetic space of Kosovo. And I apologize for taking your time here, but truly the main challenge of fake news, and I say it with full responsibility, is the fake news which is produced for the Kosovo audience, for the citizen, for the Kosovo reader, which originate from other countries. We identify that the majority of them come from the neighboring country, Macedonia. We have media which target our citizens in diaspora. And then we say why diaspora is saying or thinking this or that. Yes, because they are served such news. We can produce tens, hundreds of facts in this regard. it's been 10 years, I mean, dozens of times. Telegraph, for example, we had Express, and now Telegraph is being targeted. They think that they are on Telegram, but they enter into phishing. And every second day we close such phishing page. We had so we continue publishing not the index of fake news because for various reasons we are publishing the readability so that we can have possibility to work further. But I ask for your understanding. I think that the biggest danger are the fake media, not the serious media, despite of our shortcomings. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ojas, Mr. Mashkula. Just before I leave, regarding the reporting for COVID, I agree with Gentian that the way media and journalists of Kosovo reported about COVID-19, they were mainly cautious. Let's not forget that so many translations without criteria that were taken from dubious sources, we took them as genuine. For example, each of us read a news saying medical fluid that cures COVID. So, as Mentor mentioned, the use of suspicious sources for translation, which brings us to what Kreshnik says when we don't know what it's is source. Or, for example, yesterday there was this news. Look at Putin's daughters. Who cares about Putin's daughters? Why should our portals provide such news where Putin has two daughters? And then we look at the source of translation. Most probably, we will reach to a completely suspicious source, which, for its own purpose, for its own goals, produces such news. Thank you, Mr. Mushkolai, for being part of our conference. I hope that we will continue with our cooperation. Now, I will pass the floor to.
My name is Blerta Berisha. I'm the ambassador of the European Democracy Network. You said, Mr. Moshkole, that there's no mechanism for sanctioning media that distribute information, disinformation, or fake news. So, what have you, as the press council, done to establish such a mechanism to at least sanction or fine those media who where fake news originated from? I said the council has no mechanism to sanction, to fine with monetary fines, but there's the mechanism. There's the law on defamation and libel. You need to file a lawsuit, and anybody could be fined. Defamation and libel in Kosovo, as you know, have been decriminalized, which means that if you defamate against somebody, if you will not be criminally liable, but you will be liable with a civil lawsuit. And we work based on our code of ethics, not based on the law. The court work based on the law. We don't have a mechanism to find the media. We are a self-regulating mechanism. We're an NGO, and IMC is differently. The IMC can fine TVs with monetary sanctions, and they have to pay them, otherwise they will lose the license. But with us, the mechanism exists. However, it is through a litigation, through a court proceedings. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mushkolai. Mr. Gashe, to go back to the previous discussion and the question, what can journalists do? One of the hardest jobs for a journalist is not the research. It's not to catch somebody taking a bribe. The hardest job for a journalist, as considered by every authority, is to do fact checking, to argue the opposite of a reporting that was done in media. The most famous journalists in the world are those who have managed to prove that something that people read in the media was not true, and another reporter has deceived the public. Is this one of the objectives in Kosovo? Now I have 14-year experience in this profession, and the first challenge for me was to convince myself that I need to deal with my colleagues, with people that I spend days in conferences and coffees, and because you usually see your colleagues more than you see your spouse. You have to spend countless hours and days, so you know them pretty well, and it's challenging for journalists to be convinced that yes, you need to fact check your colleagues. That was the first obstacle. When you convince yourself, then we get to the next challenge. If we convince ourselves, we and if something happens, I will lose my job. And there are few media where good journalists can work with. I'm not talking about portals that have recently been opened or whatnot. So the challenge is to convince journalists to fact check the stories that their colleagues have done. At calzo.com, with my colleagues, we managed to build a team that fact checks stories of other media. It was challenging to convince people to start thinking about this, because the first resistance was, well, if I no longer work here, I will be the black sheep and I will no longer be able to find a job. So it's tough to get the courage and say that yes, you, their colleague, are lying. Then journalists that have worked on researches and shed light to the financing of the media and which media are lying more, they have faced other problems too. Defamation addressed towards them, pressure addressed towards them was tremendous. Only last year, because we have published information that this medium is lying or has dubious financing, we were subjected to a lynching campaign which recently has ended. 7 lawsuits we filed in court for defamation by other media. So imagine the investment that we have to do to fix our image, where we have to address 7 lawsuits filed by your former colleagues, and this exhausts you. This takes you energy, tires you. We need to really rethink whether we need to continue, or whether we need to do something differently. Of course, we decided to carry on with our job, but since we have a court system that is still slow and has problems and issues with building basic standards of defamation, that's hard. There's still a backlog of cases that wait for 5, 6 years to be treated. We've had 7 lawsuits filed last year. We still haven't been invited for a hearing. The articles, the stories about us are still there online. We cannot force them to take them off. And it's when we ask when it comes to security of journalists, what can we offer to them? First, security is that they will have to work with. They will be appreciated as courageous journalists. So the courage is now not it's a challenge to deal with the media, to find their financing, their owners. If we address these 2 issues, then we will have a safe and secure environment for journalists who will want to do this job. I try to motivate young students and the people that I train to do this type of journalism, as difficult as it is. And I see that there is much reluctance, and there will be reluctance. I hope that in the future we will be able to see journalists only as people who protect the truth, and that those who challenge the truth will be denounced to the public. What we can do is only this: to tell you that the story that you've read there is not true because of this and that. Not just to say that it's not true, but to offer arguments, to offer the facts, and for us to be the final source of information. Thank you. Now I would like to speak a little bit about women's representation in the media. NDI's research shows about a significant presence of sexist, misogynic language in the media, at least in that monitoring that it has done. What is, in your view, the situation with women in the media, how they are represented? Perhaps another question, what is the situation with the representation within the media outlets, within the media companies? Mr. Latifi, perhaps we can start with you. We have now, to be honest with you, I don't have the statistics with me, but there is presence of women in all levels in our institution. Ms. Bigole, well, this is something that we have addressed continuously, and I always take a simple example, which shows the presence and the strength of women in the media. The Association of Journalists of Kosovo and other mechanisms, local, international, give prizes for best stories, whether about anti-corruption, poverty, women's empowerment, economy, and over 90% of the first prizes are given to women journalists. Women get the best prizes for the best stories. And when it comes to managerial positions, except for those that are inherited, then we have a situation where only men lead media. We have, for example, a general director who's a man, two deputy directors, a man, director of TV, a man, the director of a radio, a man, the director of web, man, the two editors in chief were men, the editor of news desk, a man, the director of marketing, a man. So we're talking about dozens of leading positions in the public media that are all held by men. But what makes journalism more qualitative are women, as we see that they all get the first prizes. Now, I don't want to, when the public medium, not because I'm there, but because I am critical against many phenomena that are ongoing in the public medium, but I don't accept all criticism against us. I think the same story lies also with private media. I think that in all media, we see men in leading positions and the prime time being occupied by men. I'm Mr. Mashkuli left, but we've seen the famous picture of men who went to meetings in the White House. So it's a patriarchal society. We see women being hard workers, but men getting all the reaping all the benefits. If I were to speak today as the president of the Association of Journalists, I know that I'm targeted because I'm part of RTK as well, but people do not know what's my activity, why my involvement was within that medium, and to what extent I've raised my voice against certain phenomena in my institution. But people have preconceived notions, and the comments are harsh against women, and we know that when I had to speak about the attacks against women, believe me that when most women were threatened, they were attacked where it hurts the most, to the moral, with children. The men were never attacked by this, but People thought that the women will back down if they are challenged through their family, their children. But women are resilient and keep up fighting. And we sometimes criticize the primetime colleagues, and we see that in most media, if not all, the prime time is held by men, and sometimes people get surprised and they ask themselves, why aren't women being invited? But if women come, women know that whatever they say, they will only be spoken about the looks and the language and whatnot. And this is why I believe there is little presence of women in various primetime shows. Because it's difficult to work and go through those challenging comments. Mr. Goshi, the same question for you, but perhaps just to add, when we see that there is specific hate speech against women, should the media, the journalists, report this language by calling it as it is, or what is the solution? Or should how what's the best approach to tackle this? Well, we are now discussing whether the sharing and dissemination is a violation. I think that it is. If we want to say something, if we believe that something that bad has happened will be addressed only by sharing it, but without giving an additional comment or addressing that, that's wrong. Is there sexist language here? Absolutely there is, and we need to start thinking in a society that we are equal and that we are equal. This equality should start from home. But at the end of the day, it's about opportunities and how much we want to be equal. BBC has started with measurements and measuring how equal they are in giving. And they saw that it's not they're not really good. We have some metrics and we have about how willing we are to invest in women. And it turned out that about 5% of party funds, less than 5% of the party funds go to promote women and 95% go to promote men. So this means that we end up with a situation where all the ads and all the stories on TV will be about men, about those that have more businesses and more funds and will be able to pay them. When we speak about what Genta mentioned, there's definitely problems. There are problems about how the work of a journalist starts. If you go to the journalism university, you see that it's full of students who who aspire of becoming journalists, but they face many challenges and obstacles, starting with starting a family. We have the challenge that as soon as a woman gets pregnant, she will not be able to find work for a year or two. I do not know a person who started the maternity leave as a journalist and then ended up as an editor. We don't have that standard. So regardless of the performance that that woman had before her pregnancy. If you're pregnant, next year you will continue with the same salary, but the possibility for promotion will come after 2 years, when it will be less likely that you will get pregnant again. It's challenging to organize trainings for mediums because the media outlets do not send the best journalists into trainings, that rather keep them to as anchors for news than send them for capacity building. Regardless of the quality of the trainer and the international trainer that you bring in Kosovo, it will be difficult to get 12 journalists, best journalists, for that training. And the reasons would be, my boss won't allow me, I really have to make a living. And on the other hand, mediums do not recognize the training day as a working day. If a journalist wants to attend the training, they will have to take a day off, waiver that part of the salary for themselves, and that makes it even harder. And this really brings us into a situation where the professional advancement of most of these outlets that we call media is poor. We have journalists who've been working as journalists for 11 years but attended 0 trainings. What can we expect from them, really? To expect them to follow international standards, to expect them that they will be abreast of advances, and you know no, definitely we need to change the mentality within the media, and how women are promoted and what working conditions are provided. And how they appear to the media. It's in our hands to create the balance between the number of men and women in panels. It's up to the journalists how much room they give to promotion of women. I don't think that citizens of Kosovo are not smart enough, and they have shown that they are very smart and they can see the potential of our society's development, and women are the biggest development. They managed to overcome the quota, break the quota, not because of investments of political parties in them, but because they are knowledgeable and they managed to convince the citizens that they are leaders who can govern the country. So thank you, Mr. Gashi. Let's open out the floor for any possible question or comment here in the room or online. Apparently, we have exhausted the discussion for today. So Kreshnik, Gentiana, and Luan, thank you very much for your presence, and I look forward to cooperating in the future. So here we will conclude the discussion in this panel, where we spoke about disinformation, misinformation, and the presence of these phenomena in Kosovo, and how we should approach the media and what should journalists do to combat them. Now, for the final concluding remarks of this first day of the DISICON conference, let me invite to the floor the Miss Nancy Soderberg.
Ms. Soderberg?
Well, thank you all for a wonderful session, and Adea Bechai for an incredible panelist discussion, and for all of you who were able to participate in this incredible panel, and lots of rich food for thought. And for those of you who are with us in person and online, thank you for joining us. This was just a riveting discussion, this panel, and throughout the day. And I think what we've seen today is a rising threat of disinformation to democracy worldwide, and Kosovo is no exception. We heard from NDI's President Derek Mitchell on the importance of raising awareness of this threat and building resilience, not just in Kosovo, but worldwide. And from Ambassador Kosnet from the United States on the United States commitment on information integrity. And we again thank the USAID and the embassy for the support of this program today. Glenn Kessler offered his expertise on fact checking. I love his Pinocchios, although I heard from Kreshnik that you also have a tradition of salt piles. So we'll see which one Kosovo ends up using. But I think we've heard that the underscoring the importance of journalists raising awareness and their responsibility to adhere to the facts and to combat the receptivity of many in the society for this. From Velan Khorasani, we learned about the main findings of NDI's public opinion polls and our monitoring of online and social media in Kosovo. Citizens are aware of this challenge, but there's a lot of work to do in building resilience in the media environment in Kosovo and building citizens' understanding of disinformation orders. We heard from many folks today that the public has susceptibility to their own perception of what they already believe. And we need to make sure that they understand to fact check, not just if your mother loves you, as one speaker said, but where the information is coming from, whether it's accurate. And I'm pleased to announce that our report on elections monitoring during the February 14th snap election is now live on NDI website. So much of what you heard from Velan in the presentation is now available in that report online, and we're having many more reporting coming out from our work from our great information team. And I want to give a particular shout out to everyone on the information team at NDI Kosovo for today's expert. We also heard from Disinformation Nina Jankowicz and Dren for the wonderful Disi stories. And then I just want to emphasize this last panel's, the regulatory officials and the media presence and the spread of information from the media environment, the professionalism of a media industry, the legal and regulatory issues. There's just a full range of issues that we at NDI Kosovo will continue to work on. I invite all of you to join us again tomorrow, same time, 2 p.m. Kosovo time, 8 o'clock Eastern time for another live session with even more exciting news to come and more discussion of this very important topic. So thank you all, the panelists, those of us here in Kosovo, and those of you watching us live on Facebook, YouTube, and other mediums. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you so much. Really, that was great. Yeah, that was really fantastic. Thank you so much. Really great. Really great. Yes, it'll be same time, same place. So.